It is September 4th, 1781, and a group of 44 mixed-race settlers from New Spain have approached an unsettled plot of land by a river in what is today California to plant their legacy. Late into the 18th century, in an effort to further bolster their claims to empire in Western North America against the British and Russians, the Spanish Empire began its earnest expansion into what they called Alta California, given the naming convention of its lower brother. It began with the establishment of both large Spanish military outposts called presidios to defend against other Europeans, and Catholic missions in the area to spread their religion among the local Tongva people who claimed the region as home. By the 1770s, this expansion was further encouraged by Spanish California's fourth governor, Felipe de Neve, who sought to promote the construction of small grid plan towns, or pueblos, as the Spanish called them, all along the Alta Californian coast. This particular group of settlers, led personally by de Neve, consisted of 12 families, many of which were of Native American or black descent. They had spent the past few months on a perilous, smallpox-ridden trek from Alamos up through Baja California, all the way to a promising location previously scouted by holy explorer Juan Crespi 12 years prior. And now, here they are. The Spanish party finished the final 9 miles of their trek and established the pueblo right along the banks of the river near the Tongva village of Yunga. How fortuitous of them coming across a source of friendly neighbors. Once settled, the families are given livestock and an annual salary and, after a few years working on it, a few plots of land, including a house plot, 2 irrigated farm plots, and 2 dry farm plots. Not all of them stay the entire time. A few depart within the first year, and hell, one of the families on the trip doesn't even make it to Los Angeles. But 5 years later, at least, we have our first evidence of the growing settlement. A map from Jose Arguello showing a plaza surrounded by a guardhouse, 2 royal buildings, a granary, and the settlers' homes, which was a common Pueblo design. This modest town will expand in the years to come, most crucially adding an assistant mission, which would later develop into its own Catholic church, nicknamed La Placita. Indeed, Christianity, like most elsewhere in New Spain, is central to life in the humble pueblo, so much so that its name literally translates out to the town of Our Lady, the Queen of the Angels. In the original Spanish, its name is El Pueblo de Nuestra Señora la Reina de los Ángeles, though most of us better know it today by its later truncation, Los Angeles. Cut to about 200 years later, and the situation is quite different. Los Angeles is a lot more secular and Anglophone than its original founders might have expected, but it is still nonetheless a city in ascent. Over the past few decades, its population has ballooned to rival Chicago as the United States of America's second largest city. Its film industry, Hollywood, has found wild success. Its sports teams have been at worst competitive and at best champions in each league, and its arts have flourished through movements like Chicano art as well as the wild public art displays commissioned by city government. Sure, there's been a lot of other horrible things happening within city limits for the past 2 centuries left mostly unaddressed, but come on, y'all! They have a black mayor now! Racism is over in Los Angeles! And now, standing on the precipice of Los Angeles' 200th year, said mayor, Tom Bradley, is ready to push the city further onto the world stage. The Los Angeles 200 Committee, formed by city government only a few years prior and consisting of a diverse array of 44 Los Angelinos, have quite a few ideas in store to celebrate the city's bicentennial year. They've come up with a cute marketing slogan, LA is the place, begun collecting for a time capsule, and even planned a 9-mile trek into LA to replicate the route the original settlers traveled. Hell, they even designed a logo which the LA Dodgers took all the way to the 1981 World Series. And they won! To kick the year-long celebration off, the mayor, civic and religious leaders, and even Vice President Walter Mondale spoke a few words while standing in the same plaza where everything had first begun.
What can I say about a city where at a sidewalk stand you can buy kosher burritos? All I can say is that LA is the place.
The mayor's words are perhaps the most important of the evening, underscoring the city's long history of diversity and cultural production to the eyes of the world.
This bicentennial year provides an opportunity to show ourselves and the rest of the world the treasures of our city, our rich and diverse cultures, our music and dance, theater and art, our sports, our commerce and industry, our intellectual achievement, our neighborhoods.
And Bradley really has been committed to making LA a global city, not only opening government office positions to women and minorities, but pushing hard for a modern rail transit system across the city, enacting environmental reforms, and securing a bid for the city to once again host the Summer Olympics. What would go on to put Los Angeles more on the map, however, was perhaps the music they were exporting in this period. Just 10 miles away on Sunset Strip, a movement in rock was brewing which would not just capture the glamour of modern Los Angeles, but also its sleaze. Rock music was, of course, nothing new to Los Angeles, what with the bands that emerged from and toured there in the 60s and 70s. However, this new homegrown brand of rock, nay, metal, was of a far more crass, hedonistic breed than what came before. A perfect encapsulation of the city's flash, its excesses, and its faults. It pulled from a bevy of sounds and images collected from glam rock and early metal to create a hard-hitting, rip-roaring, and, in some respects, poorly aged metal subgenre which not only helped establish Los Angeles as a leading cultural exporter, but laid the groundwork for heavy metal's true commercial breakthrough in the 1980s. I am, of course, referring to glam metal, or, as it's often more pejoratively known, hair metal. Hola! Rizzy Orengi here, your music-loving, yarn-spinning virtual capo here with another deep dive into rock history. Today, I'll be diving into my first topic suggested by y'all. As you may know, I've got a Patreon where, for the $6 tier, I'll sometimes put up polls of a few different topic ideas for patrons to vote on. Now, granted, only 3 people voted in the poll that decided this topic, and in truth, I'll bet my blurb about how it could potentially become a series skew things a little. But truthfully, I've been really wanting to dive into the world of glam metal for a while. I'll share more about my long history with glam metal as we go, but I used to be obsessed with the genre as a teenager. While everyone else was obsessing over emo, scene, crunk, and club music, I was over here as the pudgy nerd that relished collecting CDs and cassettes from bands like Ratt, Def Leppard, Dokken, and a bunch of others. And now, over a decade later, I've come back to both relive and unpack that era that helped fuel my rock journey so early on. Now, this series is gonna be a 3-parter. Why? Much like Kiss's unfortunate decline in the late 70s and early 80s, I find that the whole story of glam metal fits pretty damn well into a 3-act structure. I mean, that and well, I've been keeping track of every glam metal album I can find in a spreadsheet. You wanna guess how many glam metal albums came out between 1980 and the release of Nirvana's Nevermind? Go on now, just take a wild guess. More than 250! There is no fucking way I'm gonna cover all that in one video, so yeah, it's a series. This first part here, as it says on the tin, discusses the beginning of glam metal as we know it, going roughly from the early 70s up to 1984. The second will cover glam metal's peak and the third its fall, and when both of those videos are up, I'll come back to this one and throw up a link to a little playlist on my channel with all the videos in case you want to watch them all back to back for the full, uninterrupted story. But with all that being established, let's actually get into it. Actually, wait, you know what? I just realized. My look's a little lacking for the subject matter. Give me 1 second. Okay, now, where did I put that thing? Is it here? Where? Oh, damn it, so many piles of clothing. Where is it now? Come on. There it is. Okay, now I just muss myself up a little, ruffle the hair, and there we go. Much better. Let's rock. Now, for all the glitz, glamour, economic prosperity, and cultural output there was in Los Angeles, as I said, the city had a wide number of unresolved traumas, ones which only continued to worsen, even under the liberal watch of Tom Bradley. For one, over the past few decades, the roots of its modern housing issues took hold as neighborhoods across the city began to downzone, preventing the construction of new housing. Additionally, economic opportunities have been drying up. Car factories and steel mills were closing, agricultural jobs were being moved elsewhere, and what jobs were emerging weren't nearly as stable. This was hard enough for LA's white residents, but for black residents, life in the city became damn near intolerable. As opportunities dried up in predominantly black residential neighborhoods, amplified by white flight from those areas, gangs like the Bloods and Crips emerged to lay claim to neighborhoods, extorting local businesses and dealing drugs to gain capital and fighting each other on the regular. Naturally, the city needed to respond to and discourage this violence, but sadly, whatever economic revitalization it attempted to bring to its harder-hit neighborhoods was complicated by the state force employed to uphold the law. And that perhaps brings us to the biggest issue with Los Angeles in this time period, the LAPD. Since separating itself from city government proper in the 1950s, the Los Angeles Police Department, headed by authoritarian, bigoted chiefs of police like William Parker, Edward Davis, and most recently Daryl Gates, had become notorious for its brutality and militarization. Not only were they well known for their racial profiling and violence against Mexicans and blacks, which in part triggered the black neighborhood of Watts to rise up in rebellion in 1965, but in reaction to said uprising and the damage it caused, they formed the first ever SWAT team. Naturally, they also got deeply involved in the gang wars of the 70s, forming the Community Resources Against Street Hoodlums, or CRASH, in order to surveil and combat gangs and their drug peddling operations. I'll have more to say about all that later, but suffice it to say for now that the LAPD, to give the most charitable interpretation of its actions possible, viewed extending opportunity to the city's poorer neighborhoods with suspicion and preferred instead to keep them under their stern paternalistic surveillance. That's not to say the city had fully transformed into a fascist hellhole under their watch, of course. The rising political power of minorities and women in the city continued apace, and its many artists continued to enjoy their freedom of expression in the decades to come. The over-policed, underserved environments of Los Angeles, however, would absolutely bleed into the art that its residents made. Before we continue our look of Los Angeles by the late 70s, it's worth taking a step back and asking where rock music was by this time. Well, in the first place, even though disco, soft rock, and AOR was increasingly taking up more and more of the airwaves, this was still the era of Led Zeppelin. Alongside Black Sabbath and Deep Purple, they were among the most forward-facing pioneers in the nascent genre of heavy metal. Some of them may chortle today if you describe them as heavy metal, but make no mistake, Robert Plant's shrieks, Jimmy Page's riffs, John Paul Jones's rock-solid bass grooves, and John Bonham's nimble yet heavy drumming paved the way for generations of rock musicians that wanted to push these elements further and further. I mean, that, and plus thanks to the sexuality of the blues music they, shall we say, were heavily inspired by, their music was some of the raunchiest of the day. Forget holding your partner's hand, get them to squeeze your lemon, why don't you? Led Zeppelin used to actually be my personal favorite rock bands way back in the day. My logic was, in part, they were the root of everything, the OGs. Their early recordings especially rip and ushered in a cavalcade of imitators in the years to come. Among them were American-grown metal and rock bands. Groups like California's Montrose, led by the titular Montrose Camerani and fronted by up-and-coming Salinas native Sammy Hagar, and two different groups from Boston, the eponymous Boston, fronted by technical wizard and perfectionist Tom Scholz, check out my vid on them at the card above, and Aerosmith, another blues-inspired hard rock band with long hair and a frontman with fantastic pipes. The latter especially were lighting America on fire in the 70s, going on an absolutely killer run of platinum-selling rock albums and touring stadiums across the country while snorting enough cocaine to put Pablo Escobar's kids through college. There was also the emergent genre of glam rock trickling over from the United Kingdom through bands like Sweet, T-Rex, Slade, Mott the Hoople, and Ziggy Stardust and the Spiders from David Bowie? How did you get in here? Glam rock was a more focused genre aesthetically than sonically, if that makes sense. Like, a lot of the glam look took what psychedelic musicians were doing in the 60s and escalated it, adding detailed makeup designs, leaning further into androgyny, and adding so much more glitter. No, not you. Musically, it could be a lot more of a mixed bag. While the UK acts all had their softer, poppier moments filled with twinkly piano, bright acoustic guitar, even some hand claps here and there, they could also absolutely bust it down on certain tracks. T-Rex's Electric Warrior, for instance, is a stellar glam rock record in its own right, loaded with fun boogie rock numbers and acoustic ballads with emotionally resonant string accompaniment. But then you put on Metal Guru, track 1 of their very next album, The Slider, and it's like... Such a tonal shift, but it fucking works. And the same could be said, perhaps, of Bowie's glam albums and his duality of sounds between softer stuff like Lady Stardust and The Man Who Sold the World, and punchier stuff like Hang On to Yourself and The Width of a Circle. However, no UK glam bands went harder than Sweet. While the bands definitely had their poppier moments in stuff like Little Willie, Ballroom Blitz, and Love Is Like Oxygen, there were numbers where they let loose with heavy, distorted riffs, powerful vocals, and a driving backbeat that was closer to metal than anything had been in glam so far. Songs like Fox on the Run, No You Don't, Set Me Free, and Action are all absolute heaters, and no doubt turned many an American rock listener's head when they crossed over from across the pond in the mid-70s. As much as the British glam scene rules, though, there was certainly a more immediate, closer-to-home glam rock act which presented a trashier, more American form of glamour. Once again, we gotta talk about the New York Dolls. As I said in an earlier video, the Dolls were arguably the first New York punk band in a long lineage of New York punk bands. More significantly for our purposes, with their drag queen aesthetic and loud, driving music with an attitude, they are undoubtedly the first major glam rock act to break out from there. Well, break out is strong. In truth, beyond 2 pretty damn good rock albums, they never really got the chance to grow a following beyond their native New York City. Their rowdy genderfuck of a live show didn't attract the nicest attention from strangers, especially from cops, and some of the members grew more erratic due to drug abuse. Guitarist Sylvain would later recall about his co-guitarist Johnny Thunders and lead singer David Johansen. David was bad with alcohol. He was one of those mean drinkers, and I hate that. He became known for that. And Johnny, his addiction with heroin. At the beginning there, he was so clean and beautiful, and everything was great. And that helped destroy the band. It's true, you try heroin once and you become a junkie instantly for some people. And it's so hard that they never get out of it. It changed him so much. He became like a Frankenstein and he couldn't help it. But at first he was the most beautiful fucking kid on the block, and it was really sad to see that. It was so hard to see someone so beautiful turn so ugly. That shit had him by the balls. I'm not saying that alcohol and Johansen's big ego telling us all the time that we can be replaced, that didn't help. And in truth, they already had contemporaries that were quick surpassing them in popularity and chaotic androgynous image, escalating American glam rock into straight-up shock rock. For one, there was the Alice Cooper Band from Phoenix, Arizona, fronted by the later eponymous Cooper, and dropping some hot rock music amplified by the theatrical production of Canadian up-and-comer Bob Ezrin. Though they certainly looked glammed up on the surface, their theatrical stage antics were even more insane, such that I'm not about to risk age restriction discussing them. Inspired by both the Dolls and Alice Cooper were another group from New York City going by the name of Kiss. And I don't know if any of you guys have heard of them, but they go on to become kind of a big deal across America in the mid-70s by refocusing the Dolls' glam aesthetic and Alice Cooper's extreme stage theatrics into a more marketable, branding-savvy image consisting of distinct personas and stage gimmicks for each member. And hell, Cooper even acknowledged this and welcomed their competition. Both acts would kind of start to flame out by the late 70s, though, as drug abuse and poor commercial decisions resulted in people taking their music and gimmicks less seriously. Both fascinating stories in their own right. I've already spent months unraveling Kiss's decline, as I mentioned earlier, but there's also a part of me that sometimes wants to drop everything and evaluate the albums Cooper made when he was off his mind on crack in the early 80s, because holy shit. The Dolls, meanwhile, languished in commercial obscurity through the mid-70s, losing original members like flies until a final Max's Kansas City gig with punk up-and-comers Blondie in December of 1976. It's funny, they even got to work with Malcolm McLaren, the dude that later built the Sex Pistols, for a stint, and he convinced them to LARP as Maoists in an attempt to provoke more controversy. Most notably about their steady implosion, however, was when Johnny Thunders left the band abruptly mid-tour in 1975. He was replaced, if only for the remainder of that tour, with a 19-year-old kid from Staten Island named Stephen Edward Duran. Duran, who was himself friends with anonymized guitar superstar Paul Fraley, would go on to leave the Dolls along with founding bassist Arthur Kane and move to Los Angeles to start a Kane-driven solo project, Killer Kane. There, he adopted the stage name of Blackie Guzman and began deliberately leaning into more shock rock aesthetics. When Kane decided to return to New York City, Guzman remained in Los Angeles and formed a new band named Sister, where he apparently prefigured Fear Factor 3 decades early by deliberately consuming creepy crawlies. Among those eager enough to join him were guitarist Stephen Perry and bassist Frank Ferrana Jr., though the whole arrangement didn't really last long as Guzman fired the two when the band wasn't really going anywhere. Dejected but not yet out, those two went on to form their own band, London, under new names, Lizzie Gray and Nikki Sixx. By the late 70s, the Sunset Strip was beginning to earn a reputation as a hotbed of activity for local glam rock acts. Note that I say rock. Though the music the scene was producing around this time was guitar-driven, it didn't quite try to touch the heaviness of something like Black Sabbath. Those that tried to tack that way, like Sister, were consequently more so underground acts. Nevertheless, these acts played a variety of shows at places like the Roxy Theater, the Whiskey A Go-Go, and Gazzari's, all located basically within a 3-block radius of each other. There were other venues, sometimes house gigs, sometimes the Starwood or Troubadour off Santa Monica Boulevard, but for the most part the LA glam rock scene was largely contained within a 2-mile stretch of the city. Some of its progenitors were not just London and Blackie Guzman's early projects, but, I shit you not, a band intentionally formed by Los Angeles native and rock impresario Kim Fowley as an answer to the New York Dolls called the Hollywood Stars. Credit to Fowley, he had his finger on the pulse of rock at the time, not just contributing to proto-punk and glam culture in America with the Stars, but also criminally underrated female rock group The Runaways. But, he also allegedly Weinsteined a number of the women involved with the Runaways, so as far as I'm concerned, he can fuck right off forever. But why Los Angeles specifically? What was it about America's soon-to-be number 2 city that made it the melting pot and innovation station for glam rockers of all types? Well, there are 2 major reasons I could find, one fun and one a bit more sinister, so let's have a little fun first. Y'all know the Rocky Horror Picture Show? Though it did later get adapted into a cult classic bop of a movie that your annoying theater friend won't shut up about going to see every Halloween, it actually started off as a stage musical on London's West End in 1973 before finding its way to an American premiere on March 24, 1974 at the Roxy, where it would remain for 9 months. It was this production, in fact, that led directly to Hollywood executives greenlighting the film's production and, subsequently, launching the careers of Tim Curry and Meat Loaf to new heights. More pertinent to our purposes, however, was the aesthetic it inspired in Los Angeles' youth. Lou Adler, owner of the Roxy, had seen the original West End production, and knew right away that it was the sort of show that would wow LA, but I don't think anyone expected how much the crowds would take the show's messages about sexual liberation and expression to heart. As per Adler's son,
Yeah, I think it was definitely a seed that grew into something bigger. I don't know if you could have seen it when it was going on, because a lot of people walked into the Roxy and went, "What is this?" But you quickly started to see the makeup, the tights, the outfits, the hair. It definitely grew out of, I think, Rocky horror. I think it really took popular music, rock and roll music, and mixed it with this, you can be anybody you want, you can dress like you want, kind of thing. And obviously, we saw what followed that.
on the flip side, if we return back to the political tensions of the time, that was also seeping back into another genre of music being created in Los Angeles, one which cops were all too happy to oppose. Punk rock had emerged by the late 70s, and it's true that the Dolls, the Stars, and the Runaways all played a hand in its construction, but a new generation of suburban LA punks, pissed at the systems they'd been born under, scorned notions of authority, of label backing, of new wave commerciality, in favor of faster beats, rawer guitar riffs, and angrier lyrics about the state of the world.
I have excellent news for the world. There's no such thing as new wave. It does not exist. It's a figment of lame cunt's imagination. There was never any such thing as new wave. It was the polite thing to say when you were trying to explain you were not into the boring old rock and roll, but you didn't dare to say punk because you were afraid to get kicked out of the fucking party and they wouldn't give you Coke anymore. There's new music, there's new underground sound, there's noise, there's punk, there's power pop, there's ska, there's rockabilly, but new wave doesn't mean shit.
There's a great documentary by Penelope Spheris which came out in 1981 called The Decline of Western Civilization that takes a deep dive into this new hardcore form of punk by following exemplary bands from the scene like Black Flag, The Germs, Fear, and X, and interviewing band members, zinesters, and plain old punks alike. As the film demonstrates, concerts had a tendency to get quite violent. This punk scene is literally where we get moshing from as we know it today, so of course it very quickly spiraled into a local moral issue that the LAPD got involved in on more than one occasion. Clubs like the Whiskey and Gazzari's were quick to ban punk acts for the overly aggressive crowds they attracted.
What clubs have you been banned from?
Well, the ones we've been banned from are like Blah Blah Cafe, the Whiskey, Gazzari's, Club 88, Hong Kong Cafe.
Why were you banned?
I don't know, somehow we got it. Well, a lot of the people that, when we play, they get pretty wild, and some of the clubs, they just aren't used to that. And we got a bad reputation for some reason, and then it kind of, by the press and by the club owners talking to each other, it kind of spreads around.
In fact, they gradually opted to book local glam acts instead of punk acts in order to avoid violent situations. In that way, glam rock quickly emerged as the safer, energetic alternative for the Sunset Strip's club circuit over the more confrontational hardcore. With the right club environments, musical influences, and aesthetic atmosphere swirling in place, it seemed almost inevitable Los Angeles' energized glam scene would give rise to a new, exciting name in mainstream American rock. And, in truth, I mean that quite literally. Because the moment that marks the dividing line between glam rock and glam metal would be the debut release on Warner Bros. Of a certain Alex and Eddie Van Halen were born in Amsterdam in 1953 and 1955 respectively to a Dutch musician father and a mother of Indonesian descent. The brothers moved with their family to Pasadena, California in 1962 because of the discrimination they faced from Dutch society at large for their mixed-race family. Sadly for them, American society, even in the multiracial environments of Orange County, was still pretty damn racist, and the two half-Indonesian boys who could only speak Dutch were bullied, really only finding friendship with the black kids at first. Still, they found solace in music, at first taking classical piano lessons before being inspired by the British invasion to take up guitar and drums, though it took them a bit to determine who'd stick with what instrument. They quickly began playing in local top 40 cover bands afterwards before going for more of a hard rock outfit under the name Mammoth in 1972. They were later joined by a long-haired frontman with the swagger of a carnival barker named David Lee Roth, who auditioned for them before and was rejected but was now hired because they were renting a PA system from him and wanted to save on dough. After they changed their name to Van Halen for better branding, the final piece of their now classic lineup fell into place when bassist and Eddie's fellow City College classmate Mark Anthony joined in 1974. And shit, Van Halen lit Orange County on fire in the mid-70s. Through some relentless self-promotion that included passing out flyers advertising their gigs to local high school kids, they scored a number of other opportunities from backyard parties to clubs to local festivals to city parks. Their big break came, however, when the Sunset Strip's major clubs welcomed them with open arms. They were basically the Gazzarri's house band and also played the Whiskey and Starwood on a number of occasions. It was on this Los Angeles club circuit where, in the summer of 1976, they met Rodney Bingenheimer, a local K-rock disc jockey and something of a local tastemaker since the 60s. I neglected to mention this last section, but aside from Lou Adler with Rocky Horror, Bingenheimer was quite literally the guy who brought glam rock to the forefront in Los Angeles, with his debaucherous English disco nightclub which had operated on Sunset Strip between 1972 and 1975. And now, in 1976, he was stunned by the electricity of the still unsigned Van Halen, even at a show where they largely performed top 40 covers. Perhaps even more so when they invited him to a show at the Pasadena Civic Center where they drew 2,000 people. So impressed was he that he spread the word to a certain demon named Gene Simmons, who himself was increasingly spending more time in LA. Simmons helped them put together a demo and tried to get them a record deal through Kiss's management, though Paul Stanley and Bill Aucoin quickly put the kibosh on that. Kim Fowley also apparently tried to get them signed to Mercury, but that went nowhere thanks to obstinate executives. I swear to God, record executives are the last people in the world to see where the wind is blowing. Ultimately, though, the bands were finally able to break through thanks to the influence of record producer Ted Templeman. Then perhaps most known for his work with the Doobie Brothers, Templeman was on the search for a rock band with a superstar guitarist. One day, he was called on either by Doug Messenger, Van Morrison's bandleader guitarist, or soon-to-be Van Halen manager Marshall Burl, nephew of famed comedian Milton, yes, that will be on the test later, who'd seen Van Halen on the club circuit and couldn't help but rave to him about them. And so, on a rainy Monday night in mid-1977, Templeman and Warner Brothers record executive Mo Austin went out to the Starwood to see Van Halen, and, well, the rest is history. As Eddie would later recall about that night,
"We were playing the club one rainy Monday night in 1977, and Burl told us that there were some people coming to see us, so play good. It ended up that we played a good set in front of an empty house, and all of a sudden Burl walks in with Ted and Mo Austin. Templeman said, 'It's great,' and within a week we were signed up. It was right out of the movies."
Weeks later, they were at Sunset Sound Recorders, putting to tape their debut album. Templeman and engineer Don Landy sought to capture their band in all their live frenzy, recording them all together and only going back to patch up David Lee Roth's vocals and overdub solos. The album's mix was finished by the end of the year, by which point it was clear this young band was the vanguard of a musical revolution. There's an evocative story Templeman would later tell Guitar Player where, shortly after the album was finished, He went to see Van Halen play the Pasadena Civic Center to 2,000 people, and when they were playing Ain't Talking About Love, every single one was singing along with It was a sight Templeman would liken to the Beatles at the Cavern Club. At last, on February 10th, 1978, 5 years after their eponymous rebrand, Van Halen's self-titled debut album was released. Now, so much has been said about this album over the years. Early critics saw it as self-indulgent, disgusting, and overblown. Later critics would see it as groundbreaking, seismic, and all-around fun. Suffice it to say, it's hard for me to really share my own thoughts without accidentally retreading past opinions, but ooh, I fucking love this album. To me, it's the perfect intersection of power pop catchiness and heavy metal intensity. So many of the tracks, Runnin' with the Devil, Ain't Talking About Love, Jamie's Crying, Feel Your Love Tonight, Little Dreamer, owe a lot of debt to the simple, harmony-rich songwriting approach of the British Invasion. Hell, the band literally tipped the hat to the Kinks with their iconic cover of You Really Got Me, which would go on to become their very first top 40 single. Beyond that, however, Van Halen had a killer heavy metal attack which they masterfully display in tracks like I'm the One, Atomic Punk, Ice Cream Man, and On Fire, though with their own tongue-in-cheek twists here or there. Nothing on this album was new by 1978. It was just done with a whole lot more confidence and swagger, perhaps, than any other rock or metal album before it. And that brilliantly takes us to the elephant in the room, Eruption. According to Templeman, when he was taking phone calls during one of the debut album recording sessions, he overheard Eddie in the studio going absolutely ham on the guitar, and when he went in and asked the younger Van Halen about it, he was told that it was his warm-up. Gobsmacked, Templeman immediately told Landy to roll tape, only for Landy to reveal that he'd already been rolling the entire time. It's thanks to Landy's odd instinct to capture Eddie's noodling that we later got arguably the most iconic guitar solo ever recorded. It truly is a powerhouse of a solo, starting off with quotations not just from Cactus's Let Me Swim, but Rudolf Kreutzer's Etude No. 2 for violin. This showcases Eddie's deep knowledge of rock and classical music and how it informed his virtuosic playing. And that's all before shit gets really wild. Now, two-handed tapping as a guitar technique, essentially playing guitar not by strumming but tapping the neck, was already well established and had already been present in rock music since the early 70s, with guitarists like Canned Heat's Harvey Mandel, Genesis's Steve Hackett, and Queen's Brian May having already put their own cool tapping solos to tape. And, you know, those guitarists were good with tapping and all. But Eddie Van Halen was really, really fucking good at tapping. And shit, Eruption wasn't the only good solo on the album either. Just about every track has masterful lead guitar the likes of which had only been seen in progressive or metal music beforehand. Guitarists were very quick to take note of this new wunderkind, as did the general public at large. Indeed, this guitar-driven pop metal took the world by storm. Not only did Van Halen's debut go platinum by October, but they quickly began playing with rock royalty in stadiums and arenas across the country. And they only got more massive in the following years. We've still got a lot of ground to cover in this video, so I can't go too in-depth into Van Halen's next few years as I might like, but suffice it to say that their star only continued to rise as the 70s gave way to the 80s, to the point where they were arguably metal's most visible representative in America. And shit, what albums they put out. Van Halen 2, which released early the following year, is definitely a doppelganger of the first, but, you know, fuck, they were young and eager enough to make lightning strike twice. The pop sheen of songs like Dance the Night Away effortlessly pairs alongside the harder edge of stuff like Light Up the Sky. 1980's Women and Children First and 1981's Fair Warning showcase the band's continued maturation. Not only do both albums showcase the band veering harder into metal territory, for fuck's sake, Tora Tora sounds like a Slayer song, but continuing to experiment with song structure, genre, and even new instruments like the synthesizer? Huh, cute. To be clear though, this flew in the face of both Roth and Templeman, who didn't really think too highly of their guitar hero taking to the keys. David Lee Roth was also far more about the pop side of the pop metal thing than Eddie, which only added to the tensions between the two. Oh, and did I forget to mention that in the middle of all this, the bands were engaging in months upon months of touring featuring as much booze, sex, and brownless M&M bowls as they could stomach? They were workhorses, pushing hard to keep themselves in the mainstream well after their signing. By the beginning of 1982, though, the bands were exhausted after the completion of yet another tour. According to Eddie, he and Dave thought it would be a cheeky idea to drop a cover of Roy Orbison's Oh Pretty Woman to ring in the new year before going on a break. But, well, that track became another top 40 hit for the band, prompting Warner Bros. To cajole them into recording an entire ass album to go with it. That turned into that summer's Diver Down, the weakest album Van Halen had made yet. Like, it's got some decent tunes here or there, but a lot of the album is either covers or old recycled ideas. You can tell it's the sort of thing they slapped together in a few weeks. Some of it comes together, but a lot of it is just there. Of course, they did get one more hit from it. Their cover of Martha and the Vandellas' classic, Dancing in the Street. This song is just summer fun embodied in my eyes. The harmonies and the verses, the groovy beats, and that brilliant pairing of Eddie's guitar and this wicked synth lick he'd come up with on a Minimoog work brilliantly in tandem. And yet, Eddie was disappointed at what had started as a neat original idea in that synth lick getting co-opted by Roth and Templeman into a stock cover. As he'd later reflect,
Dave always wanted to redo Dancing in the Streets, and I remember him giving me a tape of it. I said I can't get a handle of anything out of this. I didn't want to do it. I didn't like it. So I suggested Pretty Woman because that seemed more a Van Halen song to cover. It was us. I was working on something on the Minimoog, and Ted happened to hear the riff and said, "Wow, we can use this for Dancing in the Streets." So Ted and Dave were happy, and I wasn't, because the riff I had for something else got used for a song I didn't even want to do.
As the wedge between the guitarist and his frontman grew larger, Eddie took towards exploring new opportunities outside his band as a means of spreading his musical wings. In the first place, he was apparently in the running to replace Ace Frehley in Kiss. As Gene Simmons later recalled, Eddie would come to him complaining about tensions within Van Halen and wanted to join the demon in his ilk. But Simmons talked the guitarist down, postulating that his guitar playing and looks would be a bit too recognizable for Kiss's anonymity shtick. Paul Stanley doesn't recall anything to this extreme in his autobiography, though he does remember Eddie visiting Kiss in the studio, loving Steve Harris's guitar playing on Creatures of the Night, pointedly asking why the Kiss members went and did solo albums, and expressing open interest in tinkering with synths more. Secondly, and more famously, he was invited by Quincy Jones to contribute the guitar solo to Michael Jackson's Beat It, a gig which he did on the condition that he'd not be paid or credited. One presumes he either didn't feel comfy alerting bandmates to solo endeavors or upstaging them with their guitarist featuring in some hip-hop song, but unfortunately for him, this wasn't just some hip-hop song, this was Michael fucking Jackson, and everyone knew that it was Eddie's playing on the King of Pop's track. Eddie's bandmates weren't actually angry about this, more annoyed that Eddie wouldn't have the foresight to demand any commission from the hottest up-and-coming pop star of the decade. Though, in actuality, this feeling did fester in David Lee Roth's mind for the next few years. Van Halen were at the top. Their guitarist was launching a revolution in bright-eyed youngins around the world, hoping to themselves push the art of soloing ever further. Their frontman did the same for other aspiring sex-exuding frontmen on the Sunset Strip and beyond. So much had their sound penetrated into the American mainstream that now the biggest pop star arguably of all time was incorporating Eddie soloing into his tight post-disco sound to thrilling effect. But, heading into 1983, the excesses of their fame and the need to continually sustain it began to make inner band dynamics untenable. The kings of American hard rock and heavy metal were beginning to show signs of weakness, and so an entirely new generation of flashy Los Angeles rockers waiting in the wings were perfectly poised to lay their claim to the throne. Or they would have been if record labels didn't immediately lose interest in the Sunset Strip scene after Van Halen's signing. And keep in mind, this was right at the time where punk was beginning to rise in Los Angeles. Not just the back-to-basics hardcore, but hit-making new wave or power pop acts like the Go-Go's, the Knack, and Oingo Boingo were taking the club circuit by storm, attracting the attention of mainstream labels away from what the punks dubbed dinosaur music. Essentially, anything beyond 3 chords or with over-ostentatious instrumentation was out, simplicity and quirkiness was in, and the glam rockers of Los Angeles struggled to adapt in this period. As Rudy Sarzo would recall,
"You know, once they signed Van Halen, they slammed the door on metal. I was here, so I could tell you, and I struggled with it, and I suffered, and I starved because of it. But what doesn't kill you makes you stronger." It happened that I survived just along with everybody else, and they survived the same thing. There was a huge movement going on in England and in Europe, especially Germany, with Scorpions and so on. Meanwhile, back in LA, no one knew about it. No one really cared. Unless you were a band that was new wave or punk that showcased locally at the Starwood or the Whiskey or the Roxy, the record company didn't care up here. I know, because I went through that with Quiet Riot and Randy Rhoads.
which is a perfect seg into discussing the non-Van Halens, the ones who got left behind in the late 70s, because Quiet Riot, for all their later corniness and degradation, which, believe me, we will get into, were one of the earliest. Formed by guitarist Randy Rhoads and bassist Kelly Garney in 1973, they eventually joined with vocalist Kevin DeBro and drummer Drew Forsyth under the Quiet Riot moniker and earned a decent reputation on the LA club circuit, especially as the Starwood's house band. It was them out there along with San Diego transplants Mickey Ratt and a young George Lynch in his early band The Boys, which at one point had this frontman named Michael White, who was like a cross between Robert Plant and Ian Anderson. No joke, this dude attempted to spit fire out of a flute, but he didn't know how to safely rig that up, so he was literally just spitting alcohol into the crowd. Speaking of absurd stage gimmicks, after Sister Split, their whole theatrical tradition carried on to their successor bands, with Blackie Guzman going further down the Alice Cooper track with Circus Circus, and Nikki Sixx and Lizzie Gray going for more of a New York Dolls approach in London. Beyond these Hollywood area bands, there was a small scene of cover bands in the South Bay giving rise to bands like Airborne, led by Don Dokken, Dante Fox, which would later evolve into Great White, and Snow, which featured up-and-comer Carlos Cavasso and his brother, among others. The scene was stacked, but after Van Halen, record companies' eyes were elsewhere. And so they all began working tirelessly to turn the spotlight back on them. Quiet Riot, out of desperation, signed to CBS Sony, a Japanese label, meaning that their first two albums released in 1978 had to be imported to be sold, which, Still, both albums, the self-titled and its sequel, are a decent American glam rock sound, augmented by the inventive lead guitar work of Randy Rhoads. They aren't headbangers, really, nowhere near the level of Van Halen's first two self-titleds, I'll say that much, but at least Quiet Riot had something out. Not that it made them happy. I mean, for one, Kelly Garney nearly killed DeBro in a drunken rage, but got charged with a DUI instead and got promptly thrown out. But even then, neither his replacement Rudy Sarzo nor Randy Rhoads were much longer for the band. See, the Prince of Darkness himself, Ozzy Osbourne, had just left Black Sabbath and was looking for a new guitarist for a new solo band. Off the recommendation of friend and LA bassist Dana Strum, a plastered Osbourne gave Rhoads audience in a studio for an informal audition and had his mind blown. Immediately, Ozzy hired Rhoads and made him the centerpiece of his reinvented solo sound. Blizzard of Oz and Diary of a Madman should speak for themselves, I think. Unfortunately for the rest of his bandmates, this meant that Quiet Riot, Randy's baby, was disbanded. Rudy, at least, would get the chance to play with Ozzy too when Bob Daisley got unceremoniously shit-canned, but Kevin DuBrow was left behind in Los Angeles, having to start over from scratch. At the same time, Don Dokken of Airborne had left Los Angeles to go looking for a record deal himself. Not elsewhere in America, not in Japan, but in Deutschland! I mean, as I'll talk about when I get to the European section of the video later, he wasn't wrong to think Germany, or I guess more specifically in this time, West Germany, was more commercially receptive to metal music than America was. It was on his first trip to Germany in 1979 that he met a young up-and-coming engineer, Michael Wagener, with whom he sparked a close friendship. With Wagener's help, Dokken and an eponymous band he'd assembled recorded a demo tape in Hamburg. Unfortunately, as Dokken's original guitarist, Greg Leon, noted, the band still got the same runaround from the major labels as the other acts, which Leon partly blames on the fact that Dokken's girlfriend was managing the whole thing. Dokken's fortunes changed, though, when he, and I shit you not, low-key entrapped George Lynch and Mick Brown, who were then playing for Exciter, in his band by taking two of their originals and reworking them on a demo for a successful record deal with Career Records under his name. Really kicking your working relationship with your new bandmates off with a bang, eh, Don? The fact that the band was literally named after him didn't do much better to endear Lynch, who very quickly fucked off back to his band with Brown after the two helped Dokken with his album for Career, alongside old Airborne bassist Juan Krausier. The resulting album, Breaking the Chains, is a pretty decent debut, though disjointed and in some cases ill-advised. Seriously, the song Felony should itself be a felony.
Those top blue jeans that drove me wild. I did not know she was just a child.
Still, Dokken's clean tenor paired with Lynch's commanding lead guitar serve as a decent portent for what's to come, and of course that title track is just undeniable. Still, like Quiet Riot before them, Dokken's album was import-only, meaning that basically nobody in America was going to hear it. No, if these bands wanted exposure, they were going to have to grind for it and do it on the cheap. Nikki Sixx, after deciding to leave London in 1980, desired a sound and image which was more like a mix of the Sex Pistols and Kiss, and so, after nabbing Vince Neil on vocals, Tommy Lee on drums, and Mick Mars on guitar, put together Motley Crue. Crue were the bad boys of the LA Strip, partying hard night by night, methodically plastering their flyers on every clear surface in the city with their army of groupies, and even lighting themselves on fucking fire. Okay, I guess I owe Kiss's tour managers during the Dynasty era an apology. At least they have the sense not to recklessly endanger their clients. These boys managed themselves at first. They were young, they were reckless, and so they did shit like this. And to be fair, they garnered quite the damn reputation. They played the Starwood, the Whiskey, the Troubadour, all the hot clubs on the circuit, and they regularly pulled large crowds of would-be rockers and groupies alike. They soon met Alan Kaufman, a man with money in construction, looking to support a new artistic venture, and made him their manager. With Kaufman in the fold, the band didn't try for a foreign record deal, but made their own, essentially. They signed a pressing and distribution deal with this independent record shop called Green World Distribution over in Torrance, where they would keep the masters to their debut, but grant exclusive publishing and distribution rights to the company. Thus, Leather Records was formed. Okay, actually, pause. Why did the band use so many umlauts in their branding? Well, to quote a certain comic book critic, because poor literacy is cool. Oh, and because the band were alcoholics and loved Lowenbrau beer. Motley Crue were not just able to secure their own independent record deal, but record their own music for a decent rate at Hit City West. After releasing Stick to Your Guns as a single backed with Toast of the Town in May, they would return in October to record a full-length debut. As Vince Neil would later recount about the process,
I think it cost us, $3,000 to make, and we did it in just a couple of days? It was basically just a glorified demo tape.
Too Fast for Love, Motley Crue's debut, released on November 10th, and oh man, for a so-called demo tape, it's incredible. Compared to Quiet Riot and Dokken's debuts, the young crew sound far more confident and striking. Opening track Livewire goes down like a shot of espresso, and for the rest of the album's runtime, the bands deliver banger after banger that expertly merge the riffage and grooves of metal, the pop immediacy of glam rock, and the snotty, vulgar attitude of punk rock. Take Me to the Top, Piece of Your Action, Come On and Dance, Too Fast for Love, On with the Show, and even reworked London track Public Enemy No. 1 all radiate with this raw vibrancy that is just immediately compelling. There's some wild vocals from Neil, stellar backing instrumentation from Mars, Six, and Lee, and lyrics detailing all sorts of sex, drugs, and rock and roll shenanigans, and shit, Angelinos up and down the Sunset Strip were living for it. By early 1982, the band had sold something like 30,000 copies of the album, just promoting it themselves, and had played a sold-out New Year's Eve show at the Troubadour, where they were introduced by none other than David Lee Roth himself. Hell, people on the Strip were dressing like them. It was clear that these debauched, feisty young rockers were on the come-up, possibly the next glam metal, or as one British journalist called it back then, Los Angeles heavy metal, band to break into the mainstream after Van Halen. But in truth, Mickey Ratt wasn't that far behind Crue. They were playing the same clubs and living the same hard and fast life, just lagging behind by a few months. Criminally underrated guitarist Jakey Lee had joined the band by 1980, but was out within a year after vocalist Stephen Pearcy's close friend from La Jolla, Robin Crosby, came in on rhythm guitar, and the band's image began shifting more towards pirate chic than leather and studs. At that point, the band had decided to hack off the Mickey portion and just go by the more direct Ratt. Though unsigned, they'd been recording and releasing their own music since 1980, largely as souvenirs for their live gigs. Interestingly enough, though, one of their early recordings, Tell the World, would appear on the first Metal Massacre compilation issued by Brian Slagle's Metal Blade Records in 1982. The very same compilation that featured the first recording by a recently formed local speed metal band by the name of, Metallica. Probably just some nobodies. Anyways, Ratt would go on to add Airborne's Juan Krausier on bass and Bobby Blotzer on drums, as well as, at the recommendation of Jake, young gun Warren DeMartini as a replacement guitarist. It was this lineup that caught the interest of Marshall Burl, who you might remember was Van Halen's manager. In fact, it was this point that sold the band on deciding to work with him. Though, funny thing, I'm not saying he was Van Halen's manager just because this all happened decades ago. I'm saying that because he got kicked to the curb after the Van Halen World Vacation Tour for literally filming the band having sex with their groupies and then showing it to Warner Bros. Executives. Dude was kind of a freak, but hey, as Juan Krausier put it, when you got nothing, you've got nothing to lose. Sorry, verbal tick. Ratt would sign with Burl's independent label, Timecoast Music, and go on to record an EP in November of 1982 on the cheap. In addition to these emergent big names in the LA scene, there were a few other small up-and-comers by late 1982. Dante Fox, as I mentioned, were one of them, though they later changed their name to Great White at the suggestion of their eventual manager Alan Niven. There was also Bitch, a female-fronted band with a heavily sadomasochistic aesthetic that was the very first artist to be signed to Metal Blade, Rough Cut, composed mostly of former Ratt members, Blackie Guzman, now Lawless's Wasp, which was already tossing meat at the crowd, fake torturing a bare-breasted woman and lighting their logo on fire, Organ Transplants, Black and Blue, and, of course, London, who were still fighting for recognition under the leadership of Lizzie Gray. Beyond that, there were actually some bands and artists outside of LA inspired by its flashy rock sound, such as the synth-textured rock of Night Ranger and the AOR-adjacent cock rock of Sammy Hagar. For the most part, though, all these artists had their struggles and relative lack of recognition. Like, with the exception of Sammy Hagar, all these guys, even the larger ones, were virtually unknown outside of California. Los Angeles, like most other places in America, was not the friendliest place in the world to be a full-time musician. Even when they were playing multiple sets of energetic music a night, these glam bands would be paid virtually nothing by venues. And at best, maybe like $50. Something you have to understand is that the entire genre of glam metal was built off of male rockers mooching off their groupies. There are so many quotes I've read from Tom Bajur and Richard Beanstalk's Nothing But a Good Time, where musicians from big bands would admit to the importance of women paying for their groceries, rent, hell, even bail if it came down to it. Even though Motley Crue lived right near the Whiskey on Clark Street, they would regularly need to take leftover food from its booking agent D.D. Keel, as well as phone books. And you probably hear that, and you're like, oh, to cold call possible venues with, right? Oh, you sweet, innocent child. Ratt weren't in a much better situation. For their first few years in LA, they all rehearsed, lived, even whacked it out time to time in a friend's garage in Culver City. Eventually, Stephen, Warren, and Robin upgraded to a fancier place they dubbed Ratt Mansion West, which was just a one-bedroom apartment they shared with some roadies. And keep in mind, both Crue and Ratt used to party all the time, so their places would regularly be trashed. Some musicians even ended up in some of the underserved majority-minority neighborhoods I mentioned earlier. The pros? Cheap rent and easy access to drugs. The cons? Needing to navigate muggers, police, and cockroaches. And easy access to drugs. Despite all of this, grind away these bands did, all in hopes that they would eventually land that one show that'd get them noticed by a major label. And thankfully, they didn't need to wait too much longer. Slowly but surely, the dominoes began falling in 1982, and it all started with Kevin DuBrow. After Quiet Riot's breakup, DuBrow went and formed an eponymous band with Frankie Banali on drums, Chuck Wright on bass, and eventually Carlos Cavazo of Snow on guitar. With Randy Rhoads' blessing, the band eventually revived the name Quiet Riot, but sadly, Rhoads would not live to see the revival, perishing in an airplane accident on March 19th at only 25 years old. Well too soon. Despite this tragedy, Quiet Riot would triumph when Spencer Proffer, an eccentric record producer and founder of CBS-affiliated imprint Pasha Records, came to them with a simple trade offer. He would give them recording time for an album and try to get them signed, and in turn, they would record a version of Slade's Come On Feel the Noise for him. You see, he'd become personally obsessed with the idea of the song and what he'd called anthem participatory rock in general. Songs that invited people to participate. After being pointed to a Quiet Riot gig at Reseda County Club and realizing a bunch of their material perfectly fit this bill, Proffer made them the offer and the band accepted. Just one problem. DuBrow didn't want to do a cover song. Well, I mean, of course they did end up doing it in the end, but more on all that later. Regardless, even when the album was recorded, record execs, even those at CBS, refused to touch it until Proffer begged infamous hot-headed CBS president Walter Yetnikoff to honor CBS's deal with Pasha. Thankfully, Yetnikoff was caught on a good day and accepted. Meanwhile, the Motley Crue hype train was continuing to roll along at full speed. Tom Zatot, an A&R rep for Elektra, signed the band after coming to see them at the Whiskey in early 1982. Now, Nothing But a Good Time makes it seem like Alan Kaufman just kinda receded into the background before stepping away from managing Motley Crue entirely around this time, but the truth is actually far stranger. See, right around the time of their signing, Crue were booked on a Canadian tour by Kaufman's assistant Eric Grief in order to give them some road experience, possibly raise their profile. I mean, they ended up courting controversy by flying into the airport wearing their custom spikes and leather, accidentally spilling porno mags out of their suitcases, and later having a bomb threat called on one of their shows.
Who's got it in for you in Edmonton?
I don't know. We don't really care either. We're here to give everybody their money's worth for the show and play rock and roll Los Angeles style. And if people don't enjoy it, they don't have to come to see it.
Except, psych, I just two truths and a lie yet. Grief made that one up for clout too. The thing is, it was far from profitable. Doubly so since the band were already trashing their hotel rooms, so Kaufman had to cancel the whole thing midway through. Then, Kaufman continued to slide as it came to light he was seeking outside investors to, essentially, buy shares in the band, which caused them to turn against him. The fallout of that was... yeesh. Yeesh. Alan Kaufman is arguably the man that got Motley Crue to Elektra, and all it took was for him to ruin his own life to do so. Was it worth it? Critics still debate to this day. Once at Elektra, the band came under the management of newcomer Doc McGee, but then hit another snag when Elektra got a new chairman, Bob Krasnow, who hated metal. The only reason he didn't immediately try to can Motley Crue is because Elektra had put out a remaster of Too Fast for Love by them that sold pretty decently. Crue could record their major label debut then, but they were still kept at arm's length. So, even up to the point where they were signed to major labels, these initial Los Angeles glam acts were viewed with scorn and mockery by executives who would have rather doubled down on the new wave of the early 80s rather than hedge their bets on another intriguing commercial prospect. Of course, it is understandable to an extent given that heavy metal was seen as yesterday's music. Most major metal acts that I discussed in the first section were either on the decline or, in the case of Van Halen, seen as flukes. Little did these executives know, however, that thanks to the hard work of the acts themselves, certain sympathetic minds within the labels, and a certain up-and-coming music television network, Los Angeles heavy metal was soon to get its day in the sun, ushered in by the very bands that were once dismissed. And in this endeavor, they'd be joined by a number of hard-working East Coast bands who came into the glam metal sound independently. It's time for us to discuss...
Welcome to our show.
The United States East Coast has long been a cultural, economic, and financial hub, although compared with the West Coast, it had had a surprisingly thin resume of notable rock and metal acts up to that point. Whereas, even in the 60s, the Sunset Strip was a hopping, happening place for the burgeoning psychedelic rock and folk rock movements, loaded with places to play. There were comparatively fewer cultural meccas in major cities on the East Coast, and consequently fewer breakout rock acts from these cities. That said, because of how densely populated the East Coast is, bands found no issue there with driving up and down the Northeast megalopolis to play small clubs in multiple different cities. Billy Childs of Britny Fox explained it best.
We kind of viewed it as the whole East Coast was kind of a scene. Baltimore had a couple of really nice clubs, Hammerjacks in particular. Philadelphia was really only 2 hours from Baltimore, as we have a couple of clubs in Philly, enjoying most of it going on in New York and also New Jersey. But that was pretty much our region. I don't know if it really continued on south much further than that. I'm sure for some people it did, but the region's become more isolated and you're not dealing with a megalopolis type situation.
So I do hope you'll forgive me if I'm not as thorough discussing all the glam metal scenes in each East Coast city as I have been for LA. Trust me, as a native son of the Philadelphia area, I know damn well that we have our own storied hair metal history there, and I'ma tear into that John later, but let's not pretend here that our foremost musical export of the 80s was anything but Hall & Oates and the Hooters. Nah, what I'll do here instead is go state by state, north to south, and hopefully that'll bring us all up to speed. Sounds good? Good. New York was, of course, the birthplace of bands like the New York Dolls and Kiss, which went on to inspire all these bands we've already discussed over on the West Coast. Roughly at that same time, however, there emerged a sister act of these two bands roughly 30 miles away in Hohokus, New Jersey. One might say, a Twisted Sister. Formed by guitarist John Segal, who later became known as JJ French, in 1972, Twisted Sister started off very glam pop like the Dolls or the UK glam scene before gradually getting heavier with the addition of second guitarist Eddie Ojeda, singer Dee Snider, drummer Tony Petrie, and bassist Mark Mendoza. These guys brought with them influences of Alice Cooper, Kiss, Black Sabbath, Judas Priest, Hell, even a bit of punk. Mark Mendoza literally played for the Dictators for a few years, and added all these sounds into the Twisted Sister melting pot. Then, for a bit of garnish, they added some comedy. During live shows, they would, among other things, banter with each other, threaten to kick the son of Sam's ass, and attack effigies of disco music in a routine which, as I've noted in the past, maybe played a little too strongly to the underlying sentiments of the upstate suburbs. Through their lively stage act, they built a reputation so passionate they went from making a living on the cover band circuit to selling out Aberdeen's 5,000-plus seat Fountain Casino and the New York Palladium, all without an album. There were a bunch of young musicians that loved Twisted Sister who'd go on to do big things like Dave Sabo, Steve West, Bruno Ravel, and a hotshot young Staten Island guitarist named Vito Bratta. Bratta himself was going through a bit of a crisis of confidence at the time. He was in a high school band called Storm that was apparently this weird fusion of prog rock and glam rock, though eventually they flamed out. Around that same time, Bratta went to see Twisted Sister and, after the show, had a chat with Dee Snider, who immediately pegged him for a rocker. Apparently, when Bratta proudly told Snider his band only did original songs, the elder rocker chewed out this attitude by saying doing covers was how to get your foot in the door in the tri-state club circuit. What was revelatory career-changing advice for Bratta was literally just Snider being a snarky ass to a naive young rocker, but no matter, Bratta joined Jersey cover band Dreamer and stuck with them through to 1982, when, one night, they found themselves opening for a transplant band from Denmark called the Danish Lions at Brooklyn's L'Amour. The Lions are interesting because they were actually once a mildly successful pop band named Mabel that actually contributed to Denmark's 1978 Eurovision entry Boom Boom, which... Yeah, I don't think I'll ever get the appeal of Eurovision. But hey, after moving to Madrid for a bit and discovering Van Halen, Mabel began shifting their sound to metal and attracted the attention of an American would-be manager who invited them to play in New York. The night that they played with Dreamer, the Lions, and especially their David Lee Roth-like frontman Michael Trempenow, left an impression on Bratta, and vice versa, actually. Trempenow saw in Bratta his own Eddie Van Halen. Once the Danish Lions collapsed later that year due to lack of American interest, Trempenow, who shortened his name to the friendlier Mike Tramp, decided to reach out to Vito Bratta and start a new band with him, White Lion. Meanwhile, some miles south in Sayreville, New Jersey, Dave Sabo and a close childhood friend of his were bonding over their shared love for rock music. They definitely had differing tastes. Sabo loved heavy music and was literally inspired to pursue a career in music after seeing Kiss live, while his friend, meanwhile, was more about rock with poppier sounds and relatable lyrics like the Beatles, Bob Dylan, and up-and-coming Jersey rocker Bruce Springsteen. Regardless, the two remained close as they both made music moves in the late 70s and early 80s. Sabo played in a local cover band called Steel Fortune, while his friend was a singer in a number of different short-lived bands, including Atlantic City Expressway, The Wild Ones, and the rest. Sabo's friend quickly built a name for himself on the Jersey club circuit, even getting to jam with Springsteen on one of his tunes once. But what was crazier and even more advantageous to his career was the fact that his cousin Tony literally owned the fucking power station, one of New York City's premier recording studios. One day, while this young rocker was sweeping floors around the studio, he was picked by his cousin to contribute lead vocals to a big-name producer's album. And that's how John Bon Jovi's first professional vocal recording was done for R2-D2 We Wish You a Merry Christmas off Mecco Monardo's Star Wars Christmas album.
R2-D2 wish you a Merry Christmas, Merry Christmas. We hope our little message gets to you.
Okay, but seriously though, John was hard at work demoing originals in the power station during this period as well, including a very particular earworm called Runaway, which he would record with an all-star cast of studio musicians. It's unclear what happened next. Either Bon Jovi won an unsigned band contest held by New York station WAP 103.5 FM The Apple with Runaway, or station DJ Chip Hobart included it on a WAP Local Talent compilation album, which, funny enough, also had Twisted Sister. In any event, Runaway blew up into a regional hit by early 1983, and record execs were looking to sign the hot new bands behind it. Only thing is, John didn't have a band yet and had to scramble one together. Awkward. We'll come back to these young Jerseyites later. For now, let's now travel even further south into the great Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, where, yes, it's true, there were a few different glam bands in their formative stages in this period. Tom Kiefer, a vocalist who'd grown up in the Philly suburbs to a very musical family, had trouble keeping focus in high school and was already quite a partier by his teen years. When it came to his own musical projects, though, like his early cover band Saints in Hell, he was laser-focused on making them work. To be fair, as we've already seen, cover band gigging on the East Coast was pretty lucrative at this time in its own right, but Kiefer wanted something more, and began writing new material and rehearsing alongside fellow Saints in Hell member and bassist Eric Brittingham, guitarist Michael Shermick, and drummer Tony Destra. They didn't even play shows for a whole year after their formation in 1983, just rehearsed and wrote while Kiefer busted his ass on the side as a photo deliveryman. Eventually, though, this band settled on a name, Cinderella, when Kiefer and Brittingham one night happened to catch the eponymous fairy tale movie on TV. Not the Disney adaptation, surprisingly enough, but a, porn parody. Damn, early 80s TV, you crazy. Miles away in Mechanicsburg, another band arose to dominate the club circuit in central PA, or wherever else they could, really. Their name was Paris, and they consisted of Bret Michaels on vocals, Ricky Rocket on drums, Bobby Dahl on bass, and Matt Smith on guitar. One of these names is not like the others, but yeah, these kids were hyper-dedicated to becoming rock stars, touring around both Pennsylvania and Maryland and playing stuff by Kiss, Alice Cooper, and some Motley Crue songs that filtered over from the West Coast. But they weren't good musicians by any means, and their contemporaries certainly felt that way, but fuck, were they still decent showmen, and independently adopted the big hair and makeup early on while attracting legions of girls fawning over Michaels. Still, their ambitions quickly outstripped their surroundings, and by the end of 1982, they were strongly considering a move either to New York or Los Angeles. And in the end, they chose the latter because it had hotter women and weather. They certainly had all their priorities straight, huh? And so on March 2nd, 1983, the would-be rock stars packed up all their gear and everything they owned into an ambulance, a Chevette, and a green pickup truck and made their way west in search of their own California gold rush. Oh, and it was around this time that they decided to ditch the name Paris. Perhaps they thought it was a little too generic for the party sound they were coming into. Instead, henceforth, they would be known as Poison. Moving southwards one more time, we come now to Maryland, which has never particularly been known for its rock or metal music, but from which one of my personal favorite glam metal bands emerged, and that is Kix. Originally formed in 1976 in Hagerstown by guitarist Ronnie Youngkins and bassist Donnie Purnell, the band went through a number of different names and lineups before settling on Kix and adding Brian Damage Forsyth on guitar, then Steve Whiteman on vocals and Jimmy Chalfant on drums. As with most bands we've discussed, they began predominantly as a cover band, not just introducing new crowds to AC/DC tunes at a time when they were still relatively unknown in the States, but incorporating power pop and new wave tunes into their repertoire for a wider appeal. Eventually, after a year or so of grinding out multi-set nights, Kix caught a lucky break when a demo they sent to Atlantic Records sparked the interest of a low-level A&R rep who didn't have the power to sign them, but did have the power to get them in front of people who could for an audition. Despite the prevailing bias against metal in the American record industry at that point, Atlantic execs loved Kix and signed them. The result was the first record to emerge from the scattered East Coast glam scene, 1981's Kix. For a debut album, it's pretty fucking solid. You can honestly hear all the bands they used to cover blended together into their own sound. There's some catchy pop rock tracks like Heartache, The Itch, and Contrary Mary on the one hand, in addition to absolute heaters like Atomic Bombs, Kicks Are for Kids, and Yeah 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 on the other. In addition, Tom Alam's production gives the band space to breathe. Ronnie Youngkins and Brian Damage have some fun guitar moments, and Steve Whiteman puts forward a charismatic attitude that's a mix of David Lee Roth, Bon Scott, and the cast of the Looney Tunes. Kix's debut is really such a treat in my eyes. Shame that it, hardly charted, which would not be the last time that would happen to Kix. In retrospect, Kix's signing was at something of the beginning of the end of the whole East Coast cover band club circuit that they rode in on. You see, something I've been neglecting to mention so far is that this whole scene was in part fueled by the drinking age at this time. Especially after the voting age was nationally lowered to 18 in 1971, state governments mostly in the eastern US followed suit with their minimum drinking age laws. Consequently, you had a lot more teenagers going to bars. And I mean teenagers. Some of those musicians that I mentioned who went to see Twisted Sister in their club days did so with fake IDs when they were 16. It made sense for these bars to be constantly hiring energetic rock cover bands as a way of getting teens in the door. However, as the 70s gave way to the 80s, it became increasingly clear from a number of reports that these lower drinking ages correlated with an increase in teenage car crash fatalities. Give some rowdy, inexperienced young American drivers some booze, and suddenly they're more likely to careen into oncoming traffic? Who could have possibly seen this coming? Now, sarcasm aside though, it was good news for American motorists, and bad news for kicking East Coast glam bands, when eastern states steadily began increasing their minimum drinking ages to 21 in the early to mid-80s. This, of course, culminated in 1984's National Minimum Drinking Age Act, which reduced federal highway funding for any state with a drinking age lower than 21 by 10%. East Coast rock bands now had a harder time of making it. It's easy to draw teens to a show, even on a weeknight, given their relative lack of responsibility. Adults, though, suddenly the excuses come pouring in. Oh, I've got work in the morning. Oh, it's too far out. Oh, I'm not feeling too well. No, I'm not bitter. Why do you ask? Regardless, the window of opportunity for all of these bands was closing quickly. Twisted Sister, despite the massive fanbase that they'd accrued on the tri-state club circuit, lovingly dubbed the Sick Motherfuckers, still had a tough time getting themselves signed to major labels, in part due to their outrageous makeup. Hell, it got so bad that they even at one point shopped around a press kit which had pictures where they were in makeup and ones where they weren't, called the Have It Your Way variant. Meanwhile, the regular venues were beginning to dry up as either the drinking age lessened their draw or rock clubs were straight up converting into discotheques. The pressure was on, and Twisted Sister needed to find a label, and fast. They did have enough money to independently record and release 2 singles, I'll Never Grow Up Now and Bad Boys of Rock and Roll, but those weren't catching anyone's attention outside of their fan base. Until a few copies somehow made it across the sea to the UK and into the hands of Martin Hooker. A former EMI exec, Hooker had formed independent punk label Secret Records in 1980, with which he'd already had success with The Exploited, and was now met with this interesting American band who looked like drag queens but sounded like Saxon. He immediately signed them in April 1982, right around when the band got a new drummer in AJ Pero, and hired Pete Way of UFO to produce their first album. At long last, 10 years after their formation, Twisted Sister's debut album, Under the Blade, released in September of 1982. As with a bunch of the other debuts I've mentioned so far, this album fucking rocks. The straightforward drive of the instrumentalists pairs extraordinarily well with Dee Snider's caustic, biting vocals, and the songwriting ain't half bad either. There's a lot of early attempts at radio-friendly audience participatory music here and there. Bad Boys of Rock and Roll and I'll Never Grow Up Now both fit this mold well, as do new tracks Shoot 'Em Down and Day of the Rocker. but there are also numbers where the band go balls to the wall intense. What You Don't Know Sure Can Hurt You, Run for Your Life, Destroyer, and Turn It Loose are all stellar metal cuts which would hardly sound out of place on a Judas Priest album, but my personal favorite track is the title track, Under the Blade. That track, which Snyder apparently wrote about Eddie Ojeda's fear of getting throat surgery, captures the anxiety of getting put on the operating table perfectly with its driving riffs, its wild guitar leads, and Snyder's gritty vocals. So yeah, Under the Blade overall, solid effort. It didn't really have much buzz though, only charting relatively low in the UK. Still, the band continued to grow a burgeoning UK fanbase, playing the 1982 Reading Festival in August, as well as making an appearance on Channel 4 music program The Tube in December. All the while, they were rubbing shoulders with local music legends like Fast Eddie and Lemmy from Motorhead. Finally, after catching Twisted Sister's explosive Tube performance, Record XX finally took notice. And so, in early 1983, after spending the better part of a decade in regional obscurity, Twisted Sister signed with Atlantic Records. The sick motherfuckers had been vindicated, baby. So that's pretty much it for all the significant activity contributing to glam metal that happened in the US before its true explosion in 1983. But if we want a truer understanding of glam metal's spread worldwide, we're gonna need to do a bit of traveling to explore bands that mirrored American developments in their own countries. It's time we traveled to a part of the Western world where metal didn't really dip in popularity as much as adapt to great commercial effect. I already kinda teased it during Twisted Sister just now, but now we're going to dive headfirst into... Europe was, of course, the birthplace of heavy metal as we know it, more specifically Britain. Black Sabbath, Led Zeppelin, Deep Purple, Budgie, Judas Priest, and so on and so on. The thing is, it often gets lost in the weeds how crucial working-class identity was to its rise. Black Sabbath and Judas Priest both rose from Birmingham, an industrial town in the Midlands at first polluted and then forsaken by its factories and ruling class. Ryan Moore, in his book Cells Like Teen Spirit, Music, Youth Culture, and Social Crisis, does a convincing job linking the millenarian doomsaying that emerged in England in the wake of the Industrial Revolution to the lyrics of emergent metal bands warning of the apocalyptic and supernatural, which grew popular during Britain's deindustrialization. In his eyes, heavy metal objectifies power into monsters and magical forces of evil in an act of reification that symbolizes a loss of control over all of society's institutions. This metaphor, this beating around the bush of what actually holds power over society, meant that critics, scholars, indeed even the broader working class, did not really take metal seriously as an authentic artistic expression. As British industrial society continued to decline in the 70s, punk emerged to directly challenge the forces behind this change, speaking far more to youth counterculture and activism within the country in its lyrics and simplicity. Very soon, the same dinosaur music label that was so liberally thrown around in Los Angeles was employed by British punks and their newspaper critic allies to dismiss the first wave of British heavy metal. Hard rock and heavy metal in Britain was under threat of extinction and, well, the next generation of aspiring metalheads wasn't going to take it lying down. Enter the new wave of British heavy metal, or NWABM! In part inspired by the aggressive sound from recently formed Hawkwind spin-off Motorhead, British metal musicians were incorporating more and more elements from punk into their sounds to great commercial success. Elevating riffs and power chords over balladry and some of the more artsy-fartsy stuff on early metal records, new bands emerged in cities across the country, like Iron Maiden, Angel Witch, Saxon, Tigers of Pantang, Raven, Venom, Diamond Head, Girl School, and so many others that have kind of just faded into obscurity over the years. These bands were conscious about connecting their aesthetic to their environments. Iron Maiden, for example, have their infamous mascot named Eddie, whose designer Derek Riggs made him a corpse that embodied the idea that the youth of the day was being wasted by society. It's no surprise, then, that a lot of Maiden's album and single art depicted Eddie in scenes of urban decay, even straight up killing Margaret Thatcher on one cover. Wow! And certainly, while there were fantastical elements in Maiden's music even early on, their first two albums have a lot of songs relating to lived experience, including a song about serial flashers and Prowler, multiple songs about fleeing the law like Sanctuary and Running Free, and whatever the hell the Charlotte the Harlot songs ended up being. This new heavy metal, then, was closer to punk in its sound and subject matter, but British metal fans, unlike punks, saw their music primarily as an escape from the depression of daily life into a world of sick riffs and hell-raising. And there was seldom a band whose energy better embodied that attitude in this time period other than Def Leppard. Formed in Sheffield in 1976 as Atomic Mass by bassist Rick Savage, Def Leppard approached making it as musicians with the same do-or-die attitude as much of the Los Angeles glam scene did. To them, it was either life in the decaying British industrial sector or as a rock and roll band, and the choice was pretty damn clear. The bands would go on to add guitarist Pete Willis and singer Joe Elliott, who is himself quite taken by UK glam like T-Rex and David Bowie, by the end of 1977, by which point they'd adopted the Def Leppard moniker. Why the bad spelling? Because poor literacy is perhaps a little more silly and inviting than some of the more provocative band names in the punk scene. In any event, the group's star continued to rise as this lineup began to crystallize. Steve Clark joined the band as a second guitarist in 1978 after apparently playing the entirety of Freebird at his audition, and after the band's original drummer abruptly quit before the band could record their first EP, drummer Rick Allen joined when he was only 15 years old. Like, his own mom brought him to his audition. Well, at least we can say that she didn't buy into any moral panics over metal music, huh? After the release of their debut EP, which they recorded and sold independently, Def Leppard caught a lucky break, or should I say, made their own lucky break, when Elliott attended a live DJ session at Sheffield University hosted by legendary British rock DJ John Peel. Apparently, Elliott leapt on stage to interrupt the show and give Peel a copy of the Def Leppard EP. Man, you pull a stunt like that nowadays and your ass is getting tossed by security at best. But Elliott's brass balls left an impression on Peel, who played Def Leppard's tune Get Your Rocks Off on Radio 1, launching them into national popularity. This resulted in them signing to Vertigo Records, a European imprint of Mercury, in 1979. After only 3 years, these Brits, once afraid of a future filled only with dangerous industrial labor, now found themselves in Ringo Starr's home studio recording their major label debut album with producer Tom Alam. Def Leppard's debut, On Through the Night, came out on March 14, 1980, and it's pretty solid. You can certainly hear some of the hard edge of a Nwaba movement in its punchy riffs and rock-solid grooves, even in some of the lyrical themes. Shout out in particular to Wasted, which is the first, but certainly not the last, Def Leppard song about getting dangerously sloshed, and it rules. A lot of the album, though, doesn't quite land and is kinda silly in hindsight. For instance, the song Rocks Off, now without its Getcha in the title, is mostly just a kick-ass guitar riff and drum shuffle with some absurd lyrics about the boys going gaga over hot women coming to their show. When the Walls Come Tumbling Down is a full-on warning about nuclear war, complete with some dramatic narration from the start by the Straub's Dave Cousins, and it just does not work with young Joe Elliott singing the lyrics. Compare that with Iron Maiden's later song about the same topic, The Menacing Total Eclipse, and the difference is night and day. That said, as an early fusion of metal with more pop-like elements, especially the vocal harmonies, there's a lot that works here. I already praised Wasted, but I'm also fond of tracks like Rock Brigade, Answer to the Master, and Hello America, which is practically the band declaring their intentions to one day go to America. I mean, fuck's sake, they outright mention LA as their destination in the song. There's also a bit of synth work added to the track, the only such work to make it on the album. But I'm sure that won't be too crucial to the Def Leppard sound going forward. Right? Apparently, there were some purists in the Nwabum scene that caught on right away to the band's blatant attempts to mainstream themselves and were none too pleased. Fast Eddie from Motorhead would later claim that he wasn't too close with Def Leppard back in the day because they were considered a girl band, drawing far less dudes and far more women to their gigs a la American glam bands. At the 1980 Reading Festival, the band were reportedly pelted with junk by the crowd, which the papers presumed was because the audience was angry at the band for chasing that American cash. This was apparently sparked by an article written by Jeff Barton that circulated in Sounds around that time titled, "Has the Leopard Changed Its Spots?" However, it should be said that Joe Elliott's claimed the heckling happened to other bands at the same festival, so it can't entirely be said that British markets were turning on Def Leppard. Elliott's even said later that he resented Def Leppard being pigeonholed into Nwabum, taking to the stage one gig in red leather pants and a shirt covered in hearts as if to flip the double bird at Sounds journalists. But in truth, they weren't the only ones in the Nwabum scene bringing a glammier aesthetic to their brand. Down in London, there emerged a band dressed in the same drag as the New York Dolls that wore the androgyny on their sleeves. So much so, they called themselves Girl. Consisting of vocalist Phil Lewis, guitarists Phil Collen and Jerry Laffey, drummer Dave Gaynor, and bassist Simon Laffey, Girl were arguably the softest of the so-called new wave of British heavy metal bands marketed at that time. You see, Girl were far more glam than metal, citing Bowie and Japan as influences, but their label Jet Records, which was Don Arden's label, thought that they could score more commercial success with the bands by marketing them to metalheads. And don't get me wrong, their first album, 1980's Sheer Greed, isn't terrible as Nwabum, but it's hardly tonally consistent. There are some great rockers here or there, like the lead-off track Hollywood Tease and Take Me Dancing, and they do a pretty good cover of Kiss's Do You Love Me, which, as someone who has himself covered that song, I think I can speak on authority there. Still, what good rock there is interspersed with mild glam pop that Phil Lewis fails to sell. Even some new wave-ish tinges here or there. Sheer Greed did decently commercially. It hit number 33 on the UK albums chart, with Hollywood Tease charting as high as number 50 on the singles chart. Metalheads didn't really vibe with their whole aesthetic, though, prompting Phil Lewis to assertively argue in a Sounds magazine interview that Girl wasn't a part of the scene anyways, to which the natural response was, well, what scene were they a part of? As Phil Collen would later reflect on this period,
the first album was kind of like a concept. We were trying to be glam. We really liked all that stuff, but in England they really didn't get it at all. It was actually quite funny looking back on it. It used to really piss people off.
To be fair, these guys grew into their sound and image a bit more as they gained some honest-to-God experience playing live on the road, opening for such acts as Kiss and UFO. By the time of their follow-up, 1982's Wasted Youth, I would argue that they were far more glam metal than before. It's a lot more consistent than their previous album, with highlights including the straight-ahead cock rock of Through the Twilight, Standard Romance, and Nice and Nasty, the gang chants and swanky riffs of Ice in the Blood, 19, and Sweet Kids, and the punk adjacency of the title track's lyrics. Unfortunately, Girl was not much longer to last after Wasted Youth's release. For one, Dave Gaynor had left before the recording of Wasted Youth and was replaced by Pete Barnacle, who himself was replaced with Bryson Graham during the recording process. And then, pretty shortly after its release, Phil Collen departed the band when he received an invitation to join. Def Leppard teamed up with Robert Mutt Lang for their next effort, 1981's High and Dry, which was quite an upgrade from the debut. Not to knock Tom Alam's effort on Through the Night, but the members of Def Leppard have come out in the years since to themselves disparage their debut, with Joe Elliott in particular basically painting the picture that Def Leppard were a bunch of over-energetic kids more than focused songwriters. By contrast, Lang worked close with the band, and especially Elliott, to develop their commercial metal attack. How did he do that? Well, basically he turned the band into AC/DC. Keep in mind, Mutt had just come off of recording AC/DC's two most commercially successful efforts to date, so more straightforward hard rock must have felt second nature for him to streamline Def Leppard's sound. He set up the amps and recorded the drums for the album in the exact same way that he did for those AC/DC albums, and I would not be surprised if he coached Joe Elliott to clamp his balls so that he would start getting that authentic Brian Johnson shriek. Nah, but seriously, High and Dry is a fucking solid rock album all around. It's got some all-time party stompers like Let It Go, Another Hit and Run, High and Dry Saturday Night, Lady Strange, and On Through the Night, and even some more ambitious moments like the epic instrumental Switch 625. This is very feel-good, hedonistic rock in that AC/DC vein Lang was mining, except with far more ambitious harmonization and dual guitar work. Shout out as well to the underrated B-side from this era, Me and My Wine, the very best Def Leppard song about getting wasted. The standout track from High and Dry, however, has got to be Bringin' on the Heartbreak. Probably the first definitive glam metal power ballad, Bringin' on the Heartbreak is so pristinely constructed in the vein of the best rock ballads up to that point. It's like Dream On by Aerosmith or Love Hurts by Nazareth, only the chorus notches up the dial even further in its dramatic harmonic delivery. It's one of those songs with an invasive earworm of melody that you can't help but belt out, whether you're in the shower or working on a script for a music history deep dive in the middle of the night. My neighbors and roommates love me. MTV, America's hot new television network dedicated to playing music videos, felt similarly that it had mass appeal to the point where in 1982, they began to regularly include the video Def Leppard shot for Bringin' on the Heartbreak in mass rotation. Suddenly, like a lot of other British acts getting MTV airtime, the band got a foothold in the American market which they began to capitalize on, going on tour with Ozzy Osbourne and Blackfoot. By then, High and Dry ended up cracking the top 40 of the American Albums chart at number 38. Seeking to strike while the iron was hot, they went right back into the studio with Mutt Lange the following year, but by that point, poor Pete Willis had developed a nasty drinking habit to cope with the band's rising fame. Though he'd managed to lay down a number of backing tracks for Def Leppard's third album, he was kicked out on July 11th by the others for drinking on the job. Sadly, this is not the final time a Def Leppard guitarist would have an adverse relationship with alcohol, but hey, thankfully we still have a while to go before then. Regardless, in Willis's stead came girl guitarist Phil Collen, who joined the rest of Def Leppard for the rest of that year in cooking up a far more polished sound than they'd ever had before. But, lest I forget, Europe isn't just the United Kingdom, and there were a few other developments here in the eventual propagation of glam metal that we should talk about. Of course, the birth of German metal was happening around this time thanks to groups like the Scorpions and Accept, who were produced and engineered by Dieter Dierks and Michael Wagener respectively. Both bands had been pivoting from more psychedelic bluesy roots to the leather and studs look propagated by Judas Priest and Noablum by the early 80s, and were poised to go through even more changes in the coming years as they broke even further into the global mainstream. There was also a small metal scene in Switzerland, out of which emerged the band Crocus, who, like Def Leppard, were consciously shaping their sound to be more like AC/DC, and had signed to American managers with hopes of breaking big worldwide. There weren't that many other developing metal scenes at this point, though. There's Vanadium in Italy with a pretty cool Deep Purple-inspired sound, and Sweden is just on the cusp of blowing Scandinavian extreme metal wide open, but for the most part, European rock acts are gravitating more towards punk. Speaking of Scandinavia and punk, though, there was one big act that we gotta talk about from Finland. One that rocks. Hanoi Rocks were formed in Helsinki, Finland in 1979 by vocalist Michael Monroe and guitarist Andy McCoy, both heavily inspired by glam rock like the New York Dolls. Their early years see a few different people in and out of the band for various reasons, but suffice it to say, after getting a manager and adding bassist Sammy Yaffa, drummer Jip Casino, and secondary guitarist and demonetization threat Nasty Suicide, they relocated to Stockholm and were flat broke, really living up to the legacy of their inspirations, Regardless, they released a number of singles in their early days and developed a reputation for their rowdy live shows, going on an extensive 102-day Finnish tour to prove it. Were there even that many rock clubs in Finland to begin with? But yeah, just look at these guys. They are glam metal. Even if their early sound in many respects owes a lot more to New York punk like the Dolls and the Ramones, they're still evolving upon it in such a way that mirrors that same sort of give no fucks, grind till you drop attitude early Motley Crue gives off. Their first 3 albums are all very solid punky affairs, if not totally consistent from track to track. If I had to recommend any one in particular, it'd be 1982's Oriental Beat, which got a pretty damn good remaster recently. But interesting thing about Oriental Beat, it was recorded in London. Ha! Surprise, we're back in Britain. With the release of that album, the band had relocated to London and began to grow a British following. And somehow a Japanese one. Frankly, I'm surprised they took the whole Oriental Beat thing so well. And plus, even if Hanoi Rocks spent time away from the Finnish scene, there was another band on the rise in their wake called Smack ready to take up their mantle. It was while Hanoi Rocks was in London, though, that Michael Monroe met a drummer named Nicholas Dingley, or perhaps more famously, Razzle, who was largely a punk rocker to that point. So impressed was Razzle by Hanoi Rocks' flash at a gig at the Zigzag Club that he came backstage and asked to join the band on the spot. Lucky for him, he didn't need to wait that much longer. Jip Casino was imploding. Drug addiction, depression, suicidal thoughts, the whole 9 yards. And so, from that point onward, Razzle enthusiastically began his future as drummer for Hanoi Rocks, a band poised to conquer the UK, Japan, possibly Europe, maybe even the United States. Quite the ambition for a largely Finnish band of glam punks. And that's it for European glam metal through 1982. I know by now you're probably chomping at the bit to get to 83 already. Trust me, so am I, but there's one final region of the world we've got to talk about. I owe it to the historic record, if not to my own selfish weeaboo interests, to talk about the metal developments in the land of the rising sun and how they would eventually converge on the broader aesthetics of 80s pop metal. So strap into your Toyota Corolla and crack open a can of Pocari Sweat, because we're about to tackle... Japan in the 1970s was booming, thanks to a stunningly naked collusion between government and business interests in the post-war years. Japan had experienced 3 straight decades of meteoric economic growth and industrialization, resulting in a corresponding rise in living standards and consumption among the Japanese population. Large business conglomerates called keiretsu, such as Mitsubishi, Toyota, Sumitomo, Toshiba, and Nissan, all came to dominate Japanese society, while large media conglomerates like Sony weren't that far behind them. Even when the oil crises that shook the Western world rocked Japan, they were able to weather the storm by pivoting more towards technology manufacturing. It must be said that this growth was in part facilitated by a United States tolerant of Japan's more protectionist economic policies to the point of subsidizing them, also that they would have a strong pro-capitalist bulwark in East Asia. Still, as Japanese corporations became competitive worldwide in the face of Western industrial decline, there began to grow some, shall we say, revitalized resentment towards the Yellow Peril in the US and Britain. But shit, you wouldn't think that were the case from Japan with how goddamn eagerly Japanese youth were soaking up Western culture like a sponge. Thanks to a variety of outside influences like American occupying troops bringing over rock records and the Beatles playing Budokan in 1966, Japanese teens were embracing Western pop music, at first through the British Invasion-esque group sounds movement, and then through more of a countercultural folk rockish bent. Heavy metal actually came to Japan pretty early on, thanks to singer and impresario Yuya Uchida and his Flower Traveling Band, though they weren't too commercially successful in the face of groups like Happy End and the prevailing folk revivalist trend. Uchida, as it happened, was just a bit too early. There were still musicians and producers within Japan that wanted to break hard rock and heavy metal into the Japanese mainstream. It's just that the medium through which they wished to do so was the idol group. No, not that kind of idol. Not even that kind of idol. See, what we know today as the Japanese idol industry was still quite primitive, and in some cases, taking cues from similar Western acts like the Bay City Rollers, the Jackson 5, or the Monkees. This was the mindset of Tokyo music producer Yoshimi Ueno, who in the mid-70s sought to create a boy band that was a blend of that and Deep Purple. And so, in 1975, Ueno held auditions for a group called Bow Wow and built a lineup for the group consisting of singing guitarists Mitsuhiro Saito and Kyoji Yamamoto, bassist Kenji Sano, and drummer Toshihiro Nimi. The only thing was, Ueno realized that Yamamoto was like a fucking guitar prodigy. See, Yamamoto had been passionate about music from a young age, influenced by classical music, the Beatles, and the 1970 documentary on Woodstock to pick up the guitar. His playing rapidly improved over the next few years as he drew from the likes of Alvin Lee, Jeff Beck, Jimi Hendrix, and Ritchie Blackmore, and then attended the Yamaha Music School, where he was discovered by Ueno. As soon as Ueno heard Yamamoto's playing, he likely thought something to the extent of, "Yeah, no way am I getting this kid to step-touch dance," and allowed Bow Wow's sound to truly embrace hard rock. Though he wasn't much of a vocalist himself, Yamamoto was inspired to take up vocals alongside Saito during the recording of Bow Wow's debut. Interesting thing to note about Japanese rock vocals in this time. There was a bit of a debate a few years prior over whether singing in English or in Japanese was the best fit for rock music, called the Nihongo Roku Ronso. On the one hand, you had groups like Flower Traveling Band that preferred to sing in English to align with rock music's Western aesthetic, while on the other, bands like Happy End preferred to sing in Japanese in order to better convey the meaning of their expression. Bow Wow would end up falling somewhere in the middle of this. They'd sing in Japanese and in English, depending on the song, and in both languages, Yamamoto sings with passion, if not necessarily finesse. Consequently, Bow Wow were well poised to be something massive in the Japanese mainstream. After signing with Victor Records, Bow Wow and their entourage bought a large truck where they could play from, using it to flex hard for their mainstream debut in the vein of the Rolling Stones announcing their 1975 US tour in the back of a flatbed. So crucial was this truck to the band's early image, they prominently displayed it on the cover of their self-titled debut. And look, I know this gets thrown around a lot as a compliment these days, but this image goes hard. I've got no idea why they went with a wolf for the big splash image on the side. They really don't go Bow Wow as much as, "Oh!" But in hindsight, it's a great visual representation of the band's energetic sound. Bow Wow's debut album kicks serious ass, best represented perhaps by the searing opener Hearts on Fire, the funky shuffles of Brown House and Foxy Lady, the anthemic theme of Bow Wow, and the monumental 10-minute Hendrix tribute, James in My Casket. Yamamoto is on fire throughout the album. I mean, vocally, he's just kinda there, but as a guitarist, he might as well be on fucking Neptune with how out of this world his playing was. It was hard for Japanese audiences to believe what they were hearing. Hell, before Bow Wow's debut released, Ueno made arrangements with up-and-coming rock DJ and critic Yoichi Shibuya to play Hearts on Fire on Tokyo radio station NHK-FM, but with a twist. Shibuya didn't say it was a Japanese band until after the song ended, leaving many listeners stunned. There was just nobody making music like this in Japan, and in came Bow Wow, the big bad wolf, ready to huff, puff, and blow the entire Japanese rock establishment down. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that Bow Wow were essentially the Japanese Van Halen. I mean, like I said in the first place, Yamamoto was a guitar prodigy, even picking up tapping in the Wild West days before Van Halen's debut dropped. But Bow Wow also amassed quite a large fan base in short order. Over the next few years, they would drop 2 more great albums, Signal Fire and Charge, as well as a superb live recording, each brimming with electric riffs and driving beats. Though I couldn't find any info on how their albums and singles charted, it seems they were popular enough to not just appear on Japanese TV, but open for Aerosmith and Kiss when they came to Japan in 1977. Hell, Kiss liked them so much they brought them back as openers for their next Japanese tour. Regrettably, their momentum did lag a bit towards the end of the decade as, in reaction to the rise of punk and new wave, they experimented more with pop sounds. Though even during this period, they ended up scoring a tokusatsu produced by Go Nagai named X-Bomber, so it's not like they just became a non-entity, far from it. Now, granted, Bow Wow were never the international commercial juggernauts like Van Halen were at their commercial peak, but they absolutely left their mark as a Japanese heavy metal band with a far more defined sound than what had come before, to such an extent that imitators would emerge. In the years after Bow Wow's debut, a number of bands popped up across Japan pulling from their flashy playbook and expanding upon it. There was 44 Magnum, who upon being signed to Tatsuro Yamashita's Moon Records around 1982, were apparently pressured by their label to adopt more of a glam aesthetic directly because of Motley Crue's budding crossover appeal in Japan, and apparently even got their asses kicked by a punk rock band for it. They played quite a few shows in their early days with another newly formed metal group called Earthshaker, who had a similar heavy sound, except they were more leather and studs. Perhaps most important to our story, however, was the band Lazy, or as they're pronounced in the original Japanese, Reiji. Hey, that's me! Lazy were actually formed a bit before Bow Wow in 1973 by Osakan high school friends Hironobu Kageyama on vocals, Akira Takasaki on guitar, and Hiroyuki Tanaka on bass, who were huge Deep Purple fans. You gotta understand, Deep Purple were fucking huge in 1970s Japan. Made in Japan exists for a reason. It only made sense for Lazy to name themselves after one of the Purp's all-time greatest songs. After adding Shunji Inoue on keys and Munetaka Higuchi on drums, they broke through as a hard rock band on a local TV contest and, after getting noticed by Tokyo producers, moved to the capital, only to be retooled as another idol group by their new label RCA and their management agency, Triangle Productions. Fuck. The band would later describe the next 4 years as a process of returning to their roots. Though very clearly their sound was intended to be more Bay City rollers starting off, beginning with, fittingly enough, Rock Diamond, Lazy added back more and more rock influence to their sound. No doubt they were inspired by Bow Wow's success and wanted their management to realize that they could pull it off themselves. In the summer of 1980, encouraged by new producer Shizuka Ijuin, they finally said fuck it and made their Haruroku Sengen during a tour where essentially they committed themselves to being a metal band, which of course immediately put them into conflict with the rest of their agency. There were arguments back and forth between the band and their management, of course, but gradually management pulled away entirely. Even the staff at the recording studio where they were working on their heavy metal album stopped showing up at a certain point. Somehow, their album Uchusen Chikugyo, or Earth Arc, did end up releasing that December, and it's pretty goddamn good. I mean, for one, the cover art is stunning. It's made by Noriyoshi Orai, who also did all those goated Heisei Godzilla posters, and depicts this stunning androgynous angel in front of an Egyptian spaceship? As for the music, it's like a blend of Rainbow, Judas Priest, and even a bit of Boston. Yeah, they didn't entirely abandon their popular disposition, but when they really do go hard, like on Dreamer, Dreamy Express Trip, and the title track, it rules. Akira Takasaki and Hironobu Kageyama in particular go hard here. Takasaki's distorted guitar tone really bites, and Kageyama's dramatic vocal pairs well with the album's whole cosmic theming. Of all of Lazy's albums, it's definitely the one to check out. Unfortunately, Lazy fell apart pretty shortly after. Though they announced at a concert on February 18th their breakup, there are two conflicting accounts of how the band actually ended. Kageyama would later claim that Higuchi, as the oldest member of the band, usually advocated for the rest of the band to the agency and so earned their greatest ire. When there were rumors swirling that their agency might kick him or someone else out of the band, apparently Lazy banded together and just broke up to spite them. Alternatively, Kageyama and Inoue weren't feeling cut out for the heavy metal direction and left over that, essentially ending the band right there. Shame the whole Hararoku Sengen didn't last too long, but hey, at least Kageyama would find a successful career for himself as an Annie-song vocalist, as the guy who sang lead on Chala Head Chala, no less. The remaining three Lazies decided to form a new project and, after an audition, found a new singer in Minoru Nihara, who ironically had left Earthshaker a few years prior attempting to get away from metal. This new band, Loudness, intentionally leaned even further into the Bow Wow direction by ditching keys, and to thrilling effect. Their first two albums, 1981's The Birthday Eve and 1982's Devil Soldier, are both solid, if sprawling, efforts. Takasaki's guitar playing only continued to blossom as all the solo projects from both albums clearly demonstrate. Some of their tracks, though, go on way too long in that way where you can tell the band were still feeling out their newer, heavier direction. They seem torn, in some respects, with being an edgy metal band versus being more cock-rocky. At the same time, I can't deny heaters like Open Your Eyes, I'm on Fire, Angel Dust, and Loving Maid. The band clearly had a bunch of potential that they'd yet to truly capitalize on. Like, they literally sold out a 2,700 capacity theater for their debut gig, so there was certainly hype behind their early career. Still, they quickly realized the limitations of a career confined to the Japanese market and aimed for more. At the exact same time, Bow Wow made a similar pivot. Like Michael Jordan returning to the Bulls, Bow Wow somehow once again released 3 back-to-back bangers in 1981 and 1982. Hard Dog, Asian Volcano, and Warning from Stardust. Hard Dog in particular is probably the most kick-ass of the bunch. I mean, it's literally named Hard Dog, and shit, it really does go hard dog. But my personal favorite is probably Warning from Stardust. Tracks like You're Mine, Jets, and Clean Machine are absolutely undeniable. At this point, Bow Wow were gaining more of an overseas reputation. They'd played abroad in Hong Kong a few different times in early 1982, then toured Europe and played the Montreux Jazz Festival that July. And then, much like Hanoi Rocks before them, they ended up in the UK recording Warning from Stardust in a British studio. The Siren Song of Nwabum was just that powerful, I guess. Curiously, though, the British loved Bow Wow. They not only got the chance to play the 1982 Reading Festival, but also opened for a number of Hanoi Rocks shows. You see, there's a method to my madness here. I'm not just bouncing around from hyperfixation to hyperfixation, I swear. Some of you might view my use of glam metal to describe these Japanese bands as hyperbolic, perhaps a bit inaccurate. Well, they were touring and hobnobbing with the exact same bands that go on to influence glam metal, so there's that. But also, look at the fucking hair they'd rock. Like, the actual metal music most were making at this time wasn't strictly glam, but aesthetically, just you wait. And so I think, finally, we're caught up to speed with all the relevant glam metal developments in the world before 1983. Oi! What about us, eh? Oh, yeah, I mean, I guess there were some glam metal adjacent developments in Canada at that time too. At least, Martin Popoff seems to categorize some Canadian AOR like Loverboy and April Wine under glam metal. Most significantly about that, for our purposes, was the success that young emergent producer Bruce Fairbairn had with Loverboy. Say what you will about how well those early Loverboy albums have aged, but they did have a very modern, for the time, production. Plus, there was actually another up-and-coming Canadian metal band which was veering towards glam metal aesthetics named Helix. Still, Canada wasn't too important to the glam metal story at this point outside of maybe those bands. Nah, sorry mates, but I think we're finally ready to talk about glam metal's true breakthrough. I mean, I'm 31 goddamn pages into this thing by now. I should probably be moving right along. Still though, if you'll indulge me, I want to do the whole YouTuber analytic check-in thing and say thank you so much for sticking with me this far into the video. Like my other deep dive projects, it's taken me a bit to put it all together, so I'm eternally grateful whenever I get any eyes on my channel. If you're watching though and aren't yet subscribed, which I understand describes a lot of you, why not do so, maybe even like the video and comment below, and stick around for more hair metal content to come. I swore to y'all that I'd make a follow-up to my Kiss deep dive series when I hit 10,000 subscribers a while ago, and I'm still holding to that, honest to God. Speaking of my last deep dive series though, you might recall then that I made a supplemental deep dive into the post-Kiss solo careers of Ace Frehley and Peter Criss, which you can access by subscribing to my Patreon. I've decided to do something similar once again, a Patreon-exclusive deep dive into Gene Simmons' lesser-known career as a glam metal producer in the 80s, wherein I'll talk about some more obscure bands like Black and Blue, House of Lords, and another Japanese act named Eizo. For only $2 a month, you can gain access to exclusive supplemental deep dives and reviews like those, ad-free versions of my deep dives on YouTube, and monthly blog posts updating y'all on my life, my projects, and the future of the channel. But for a bit more, you can participate in Q&A threads and polls over future content when applicable. If I reach 2,000 patrons, I'll also take that as a cue to work on the Kiss sequel series, but I realize how ambitious reaching that number is with my current pace. Really, I'm just grateful for any financial support you could give. I've also got a Ko-fi if you prefer to make one-off donations. But with all that shilling out of the way, it's time to get to the year heavy metal finally went mainstream. We're breaking down! So for the next half of the video, I'm not sure roughly how chronological I'm going to take things, given the utter girth of everything I've covered so far, but I'm going to try to bring some sort of order to all these steadily converging details. I guess we can crack open this list and go from here? Right away in January, Def Leppard released a mammoth of an album that finally broke them into the American market for good, Pyromania. In a world where hard rock and heavy metal were still trying to find their market on MTV, this album grabbed the station by the balls and screamed, "Pay attention to us!" Learning from their mainstream penetrative successes with High and Dry, the band decided to lean far more into their harmonies and melodic pop hooks than before, while still, to some degree, having an AC/DC-ish edge carried over from the last album. Probably the most noticeable new layer is the synth work. Lang had a few different session keyboardists come in to add texture to tracks, including Tony Kaye of Yes and Thomas Dolby of Science Blinding fame. Science! And look, I won't sugarcoat it. It was a controversial decision. To this day, there is a sizable contingent of Def Leppard fans who see this album as the dividing line between when they were legit and, well, when they were less so.
Suppose the rock's out of the question.
In truth, though, the band never saw it as them selling out, per se, merely coming into their own sound. As Phil Collen would put it,
when I joined, I definitely could see that the difference between the first and second album was pretty huge. And the difference between the second and third album was even bigger. And I also think the difference between Pyromania and Hysteria was massive. I think with each album, it got more open-minded. I think with a lot of rock bands, they're very close-minded. All the stuff we're talking about, the leather thing, oh no, you can't use that influence, all the cliches. When I joined the band, I could sing a bit of well, which was different, because I know there were big vocals going on, but it all kicked in. The band really was influenced by Queen, and I think we wanted to be that, but not just that. We wanted Zeppelin, we wanted Stevie Wonder, The Police, The Fix, a lot of the punk stuff, 3-minute songs, and when I joined, all the songs were written already for Pyromania, so I just had to play solos on top, basically, do a bit of singing, just, my impression of it was, I'd never heard anything quite like it, because it was an absolute hybrid. A rock hybrid.
Me personally, I fucking love Pyromania. So much of the album is perfectly balanced pop metal, such as Rock Till You Drop, Stage Fright, Action Not Words, and the underrated techno-dystopian epics Die Hard the Hunter and Billy's Got a Gun. It's in the singles, though, where the album really shines. Not all of them were hits, but damn it, all of them were catchier than zippers at the least convenient time. Too Late for Love, Foolin', and Rock of Ages are stellar, truly essential stadium rock to include on any Best of the 80s compilation or playlist. But outclassing all of them was the album's leading single and the song which truly broke Def Leppard in America, Photograph. Elliot's poppy lament over his inability to hook up with Marilyn Monroe, only partly joking there, Photograph has an incredible bounce of pining Elliott vocals, powerful harmonies, and arena-ready backing instrumentation, including a sick solo from Colin. Released around the same time as the album, the song was arguably one of the first glam metal tunes to become a top 40 American hit, off the back of its video getting considerable airplay on MTV. After entering the charts in March, the single climbed to a respectable number 12, ensuring a continued presence for the formerly Nwabum band in the States for the foreseeable future, especially when Foolin' and Rock of Ages also hit it big on MTV. Pyromania would go platinum by April and eventually reach number 2 on the album charts behind only Thriller, and Def Leppard would proceed to play 178 shows over the course of another year in support of it, during which they were on top of the world. Though, of course, not if their contemporaries had anything to say about it. On February 28th, Quiet Riot finally released their third album and their first on an American major label, Metal Health. That said, I guess in hindsight it's more like a reintroduction to the band, given how crucial Randy Rhoads was in their early years. It wasn't like the new Quiet Riot were erasing his history with the band, oh, far from it. Slick Black Cadillac was revived and streamlined for the album. Its title track was inspired by Rhoads telling Kevin DuBrow about how British metal audiences were headbanging to Nwabum, and Thunderbird is a sweeping emotional tribute to the guitarist, which DuBrow explicitly brought Rudy Sarzo back to record bass for. That said, the album is a lot more metal than their previous two. In the past 5 years, DuBrow had focused on writing heavier, more anthemic songs, and the results are pretty solid. Love's a Bitch, Run for Cover, and Let's Get Crazy are all solid in this regard, though my personal favorite is, of course, Metal Health, Bang Your Head. In addition to having probably the greatest introductory 10 seconds of any metal song ever, it's got the perfect guitar tones, backbeats, and lyrics to define an entire generation of up-and-coming American metalheads, our own version of Saxon's Denim and Leather, if you will, except with far more screaming. The big crossover hit of the album, though, was, of course, the Slade cover song they'd been cajoled into recording, Come On Feel the Noise. Now, interesting thing about this cover, those with their ears to the rhythm might notice that the drumming here is far more straightforward than on the original version. Well, that was kinda by design. Frankie Banali and DuBrow wanted to sabotage the cover so that Spencer Proffer wouldn't use it on the final album, so Banali refused to practice the song. When it came time for the band to record the backing tracks, though, Banali delivered a simple, if still solid backbeat that better served the song. Like, I'm serious, as cool as the original Slade groove is, it doesn't really scream anthemic like Banali's does. After they ran through it, well...
Spencer goes, man, I wish we had recorded that. And the engineer says, come on in, I did. So Spencer bolts out of the room. And as he bolts out, Kevin comes in from the corner, grabs me by the arm so hard he almost dislocates my shoulder, and drags me out of the room. And he goes, what the fuck was that? And I say, I don't know, man, I just started playing. I'm tap dancing at this point. He goes, what am I supposed to do now? So I told him, well, you can fuck it up by singing like shit. And I turned around and walked away because I knew in Kevin's mind, he wouldn't allow himself to be the one that sucked. And he didn't. He sang it great.
You ever just accidentally stumble kicking and screaming into creating the biggest hit in your music career? Because, yeah, the anthem participatory rock tune that Spencer Proffer sought to bring to the masses would, thanks to its zany music video receiving regular MTV rotation, climb the charts later that year until peaking at number 5 in November, the very first glam metal top 10 hit. God, I bet Kevin DeBro was fucking pissed. That anger absolutely abated, though, as sales numbers for the Metal Health album continued to rack up. Very soon, Quiet Riot were on the road as openers for bands like ZZ Top, Loverboy, Black Sabbath, and Iron Maiden, even headlining here or there. The album's greatest success came in November. Alongside going platinum, it would hit number 1 on the Billboard album charts. Number 1! In a year where the charts were mostly dominated by either Michael Jackson's Thriller or the Police's Synchronicity, somehow Quiet Riot had built up enough momentum to be the first metal band to hit number 1. That is fucking insane! Think how many calls to radio stations and MTV were made, how many venues were played throughout the year to turn Quiet Riot from virtual unknowns into the literal number 1 band in America. Crazy. No wonder when they heard the news, they popped champagne. March comparatively didn't really see any notable glam releases, though there were quite a few important events still. On the 2nd, as I noted before, Poison began their daring journey out to Los Angeles from the East Coast. Their contemporaries Kix, meanwhile, were poised to drop their second major label album. Kix had actually played shows with Poison back when they were still Paris, and weren't too positive about the young band's chances of making it. According to Brian Damage, when hearing about their move, Steve Whiteman would say, "If these guys get signed, I'm gonna quit the business and start making pizza." Just keep that little quote in mind for later. The karmic gods running the universe must have instantly heard Whiteman's trash talk, though, because when Kix's second album, Cool Kids, came out on March 7th, it didn't chart. Like, at all. In spite of a concerted effort to lean into more new wave-ish and power poppy sounds. Ouch. I will say, I like a few different tracks, like the title track and Love Pollution, but most of that album hasn't aged as gracefully as Kix's debut. Of course, synths are not necessarily bad in metal when produced well. I just spent a few minutes glazing Pyromania for fuck's sake. But the producer here, Peter Solly, was no Mutt Lange. Helix also put out a more commercially focused album than their past two on the 11th, with No Rest for the Wicked, mixed by Tony Bongiovi. It's a solid all-around effort that tacks close to Nwabum by way of Def Leppard, and frankly, I'm surprised the video for Heavy Metal Love didn't generate hype for them. And then again, Americans have always been more selective of Canadian music crossing the border than vice versa, so... Oh, speaking of Tony Bongiovi, his cousin John quickly gathered together a group of musicians to back him this month after the success of Runaway in the tri-state area. Backing him up for an initial brief 3-week tour were bassist Alec John Such, keyboardist David Bryan, drummer Tico Torres, and his old childhood friend Dave Sabo on lead guitar. Unfortunately, this arrangement didn't last long, as Such's friend Richie Sambora, recently returned from auditioning for lead guitarist of Kiss in LA, came to see these early shows and, impressed with John's band, approached him after the show. He spoke at length about his experience in bands to that point with hopes of joining. One thing led to another, and suddenly Sabo was out and Sambora was in. John swore to Sabo that he'd do what he could to help him break into the music business.
Up! Don't leave me here! We'll come back for you! You bastards!
Now, I swear I'm not going to go too in-depth with every band's touring schedule for this entire series, but there's one more significant development that happened this month that I want to get into, and it has to do with Motley Crue's touring schedule. In the middle of the recording sessions for their follow-up to Too Fast for Love, they landed their first major touring slot opening for their influences Kiss on the western leg of the Creatures of the Night tour, which I already kind of talked about back in my Kiss series. As I said then, Naturally, the party animal nature of the band did not jibe well with Gene Simmons. Nikki Sixx has claimed in the years since that they got kicked off the opening slot, but, how can you when you're the opening act of the final date of the tour? All the same, Motley Crue absolutely blew Kiss out of the water night after night, and the papers were not shy to mention it. Some notes to add to past Resi there. 1. The final date of the tour wasn't necessarily set in stone. Kiss could have booked more, but they would have sold like ass. 2. Sixx has also claimed more specifically that Crue were kicked off the tour because he and Tommy Lee cucked Eric Carr during Rock and Roll All Night in Phoenix. The poor fox could not catch a break, man. Still, the Kiss camp clearly weren't entirely put off by the rising glam aesthetic coming out of the West. In fact, with their commercial fortunes lagging, I bet you they were looking at bands like Crue with dollar signs in their eyes. More on that in a bit. April saw the UK release of Twisted Sister's major label debut, You Can't Stop Rock and Roll, which is pretty much like Under the Blade if every track had the energy of an anthem. Hell, the title track would have actually been on Under the Blade if Martin Hooker hadn't been so much of a stick in the mud about not having tracks with rock and roll in the title. But now that the band had a little more wiggle room to develop themselves on Atlantic, they went full hog into the scrappy, the cocksure, the motivational songwriting that had become their hallmark. The title track, The Kids Are Back, Like a Knife in the Back, I'm Me, Ride to Live, Live to Ride, We're Gonna Make It, just so many rippers on this album which just didn't break through. In America, at least, the UK loved Twisted Sister by this point and had its own contingent of sick MFs that brought The Kids Are Back and I'm Me into the top 40 there. By that point, Atlantic Records were like, oh shit, these guys might actually be worth promoting, and filmed a music video for You Can't Stop Rock and Roll where the band converted a covert spy from the so-called Taste Squad to their rock and roll ways. Even though Def Leppard and Quiet Riot were blowing up MTV phone lines by this point, though, Twisted Sister's videos unfortunately didn't get the same hype behind them. Yet. So I'm not entirely sure if this next thing all happened in April or if it was in or around April, but this is almost certainly the best place on our timeline to put it. Dokken were having some troubles locking in a major label deal. Sometime earlier in the year, Don Dokken apparently drove up to Green World Distribution in a fixed-up white 56 Bentley, went into Alan Niven's office, sat at his desk, and slapped down a European copy of Breaking the Chains, and presumably his enormous dick, while saying, I want you to do for me what you did for Motley Crue. Niven connected the brazen rocker with manager Cliff Bernstein, who got Dokken a tentative deal with Elektra. Until Bob Krasnow took over as chairman there in April and got in the way with his dislike of metal. While this saga of Dokken negotiating a deal, or at least an audition, continued, George Lynch was actually in the running for a while for becoming Ozzy Osbourne's new guitarist. He went on the road with the rocker for a few weeks, played at sound checks with his band, and even rehearsed with them a few times, but nope! Jakey Lee was ultimately Ozzy's guy. Apparently he was a more tasty guitar player, whatever Ozzy means by that. Still, George Lynch was crushed. So crushed that he willingly went to Don Dokken himself and was like, hey, are you still doing that Dokken thing? But a funny thing, while Lynch was schmoozing with Ozzy, Juan Krausier had joined Ratt and invited his friend Warren DeMartini to replace Lynch, and suddenly,
You got
Ratt,
from my
Dokken,
Well, you got
Dokken,
my
Ratt. So then Lynch decided to go jam with Ratt a bit, and just as everyone reached a fever pitch of musical chairs, or musical musicians as Dokken stiltedly put it, Dokken and Lynch bumped into each other and were like, what are we doing? From that moment on, Krausier went back to Ratt with DeMartini, and Lynch formally rejoined Dokken, which soon after passed a crucial audition for Elektra. Here's to new beginnings, eh, George and Don? Ratt, speak of the devil, finally saw the release of their debut EP in May. It's a solid debut release all around. Sweet Cheater opens things appropriately with a bang, You Think You're Tough, You Got It, and the aforementioned Tell the World display Ratt's soon-to-be trademark swagger expertly. Walkin' the Dog is a fun reinvention of an old R&B tune, and Back for More, while a bit unwieldy in its back half, is a masterful showcase of the potential of guitar duo Robin Crosby and Warren DeMartini. Still, there was far better to come in Ratt's career. Hell, they were kinda sitting on a banger already. But hey, the EP sold enough copies on the LA circuit where Doug Morris of Atlantic Records would sign them later that fall, officially putting Ratt on the same track to fame as their peers. Just one condition. They had to go with novice producer Beau Hill. And like Quiet Riot, they weren't exactly the happiest campers with that precondition. But more on how that turned out later. Hanoi Rocks also dropped a new album in May. This one, Back to Mystery City, was actually produced by ex-Mott the Hoople members, and it's alright. Full disclosure, this deep dive is the first time I've seriously listened to Hanoi Rocks. I knew that they were a major influence on glam metal aesthetics, but sonically, I'm not as big on their glam punkish sound. It smacks a bit too basic and rock and roll revivalist for my tastes. That said, even I can't deny fun tunes like Malibu Beach Nightmare, Until I Get You, and the title track. I completely get why their year up to that point was defined by a wildly successful Asian tour and continued success in the UK. There was also a less than successful venture to Israel where audiences didn't like them and their feminine looks got jeered at by locals at the Wailing Wall. Probably not the smartest idea to drop them in that part of the world, but hey, at least with Mystery City's release, they attracted more attention from American labels such that they signed with CBS in June. The biggest thing we gotta talk about this month, though, is the 1983 US Festival. Largely the conception of Apple co-founder Steve Wozniak, the US Festival was a combination rock and technology fest in the vein of something like South by Southwest. It had been held for the first time the previous Labor Day weekend in San Bernardino, California, as a means of promoting a more community-oriented mindset for the 80s away from the me generation of the 70s. Despite booking some major acts like The Cars, The Police, and Fleetwood Mac, or likely in part because of it, the first US Festival was a $10 million failure. Trying again over Memorial Day weekend, Woz and promoter Barry Fay organized 3 distinctly themed days: New Wave Day, Heavy Metal Day, and Rock Day. Oh, and a Little Country Day the following weekend. For our purposes, we turn now to Heavy Metal Day on May 29th, which was just insane. Not only had the festival booked some established metal acts from abroad like Judas Priest, Triumph, The Scorpions, and Ozzy with a freshly hired J.K. Lee, but it gave local SoCal talents Motley Crue and Quiet Riot their time to shine as well. Motley Crue's performance at the festival in particular is what I consider my platonic ideal of them. Loud, unrelenting, dolled up, and in your face. And the crowds only matched that energy. Of the 670,000 tickets sold for the festival, more than half were there for Heavy Metal Day, enduring brutal heat for a chance to let out some pent-up aggression. All of it was prelude to the legendary Van Halen's headlining performance that night, capping off a wildly successful... Wait, they played for how much? The festival lost that much again? And how fucking drunk was David Lee Roth?
I forgot the fucking word!
Damn, that Apple II money went a long way in making up for Woz's fuck-ups, huh? By the summer of 1983, it was apparent to major labels that heavy metal was beginning to have some sort of a moment. Oddly enough, though, there were practically no major glam metal releases to speak of between the end of May and the end of September. Though, if we want to start getting into the weeds... Long before the Confederate flag guitars and the guttural vocals and the black-tooth grin, Pantera were a high school glam band formed in Arlington, Texas by brothers Vinny and Daryl Abbott and their friends Robert Brown and Terry Glaze. Thanks to their country singer dad, the Abbotts were able to self-record and release an album, Metal Magic, in June of 1983, and it's, and I mean this with all the love in my heart for high school musicians that put themselves out there like this, utter fucking ass. It's musically competent, but you can tell the Abbotts were just mainlining Van Halen and Kiss nonstop. Still, the Young Panthers earned a local reputation touring not just all around Texas before its drinking age increased past 18, but a bit into Oklahoma and Louisiana as well. They were kinda an outlier in that respect. There was another southern glam-adjacent band from this time floating around called Zebra, but they'd actually moved up to New York to play the same circuits as Twisted Sister. Pantera, by contrast, were southern and proud. Maybe a little too proud as it would turn out later, but at the exact same time, a new wave of glam rockers was beginning to emerge in Los Angeles as a direct consequence of the genre's explosion. In the first place was LA Guns, a band formed by eponymous guitarist Tracy Guns and his drummer friend Rob Gardner. After adding Mike Jagaj on vocals and Ole Beach on bass, they began their own Sunset Strip grind where they met Indiana transplant, guitarist, and Hanoi Rock's Uber fan Jeffrey Isbell, aka Izzy Stradlin, who was looking to form his own band. Guns, relating to Stradlin's taste in metal, quickly connected Stradlin with another friend of his, fellow guitarist Chris Weber, and the two quickly hit it off, forming a band in June of '83 along with drummer Johnny Kreis. Stradlin was insistent that the two hire another friend of his from Indiana for vocals by the name of Bill Rose. And sure enough, when the red-headed vocalist finally settled in LA, he linked up with his old Hoosier buddy. This band went through a number of changes in its brief lifespan. In addition to a revolving door of local bassists, they adopted a number of names. At first it was Axel, but then Izzy and Bill got in a spat and Izzy refused to play under the name Axel again. "More edge for me," Bill presumably replied, taking the name for himself. Then the band was named Rose before they realized they'd been beaten to the punch. But to paraphrase Shakespeare, a rose by any other name would smell as, pungent, so the band just decided to slap their location in front and call it a day. So now, among a new generation of glam talents, LA had some Guns and a little bit of Rose. I suppose something else important to mention about the summer of '83 was the emergence of female-fronted glam metal, which, in a genre so far owed to women's objectification and exploitation, was no small feat. There was that sadomasochistic band I mentioned earlier, Bitch, fronted by Betsy Weiss, and they put out a full-length debut in July loaded with fetish-laden lyrics. It's fine, I love the instrumentation, and Betsy Weiss isn't half bad as a vocalist. All the same, and this may be my asexual-leaning ass speaking here, but this does nothing for me but make me cringe. It's cool and empowering for women, sure, but Judas Priest these guys ain't. Around the same time, Lita Ford of the Runaways was making a dramatic career pivot. I forgot to mention this, but the Runaways flamed out relatively soon after their formation, owing to a schism between Joan Jett, who was leaning more into the Los Angeles punk scene, and Ford, who wanted to stick with hard rock. While Jett, as we know, was quick to pivot into mainstream success with her embrace of punk and new wave, Ford stayed true to her love of rock and metal, and so was a little slower to attract major label attention. Nevertheless, she persisted. If not to make it big, then certainly to make a point. As she'd later reflect,
"Nobody was taking me seriously as a guitar player because it was before our time. Girls don't play electric heavy metal guitar. They might have played blues, or they might have played bass, or they were a singer, but they didn't play heavy metal guitar. I thought, I do. I want to prove to the world that it's me playing guitar, because nobody believed me. That's why I insisted that I be the only guitar player in my first solo band. I wanted to put that in people's faces by there being no other guitar players on stage to look at. Within 3 months of doing that, I was playing shows and I got signed. But let me tell ya, even after that, when we did TV shows, I'd be playing the solo and the cameraman would pan over to the bass player, 'cause he's a guy. It was absolutely ridiculous."
And lest you think this was an isolated incident, Maxine and Roxy Petrucci of recently formed Midwestern glam act Madam X faced similar discrimination. Ford's '83 debut, the appropriately titled Out for Blood, is thus a perfectly aimed dagger at the heart of early glam metal misogyny. Not only does Ford play all the lead and rhythm guitar parts herself, but proves herself to be more than capable of writing solid rockers like the title track, Stay With Me Baby, and I Can't Stand It, and a power ballad in Just a Feeling. Unfortunately, mainstream America wasn't quite ready for a heavy metal maiden like Lita, especially with this album art, yeesh, and Out for Blood failed to chart. But surely the emergence of more female talent in LA will encourage the boys to shy away from their more meat-headed tendencies, right? So anyways, back to Motley Crue, who by the end of the summer were coming off of months of recording fueled by drugs, alcohol, and copious amounts of sex with faceless, nameless groupies. Guided along by veteran producer Tom Werman, who'd worked with Ted Nugent, Cheap Trick, Blue Oyster Cult, and Molly Hatchet, the Crue boys managed to cook up an absolute beast of a sophomore album, Shout at the Devil, released on September 23rd. It's a fitting major label follow-up to Too Fast for Love, complete with bombastic, arena-ready production and catchier hooks than ever. There are a few moments of softness here or there, including the proto-balladry of Danger, but for the most part, this album is just relentless. Looks That Kill, Too Young to Fall in Love, and the title track have cemented themselves as rock radio classics for good reason, but all the deep cuts rule too. Bastard, Red Hot, Knock 'Em Dead Kid, 10 Seconds to Love, just cock rock caviar, that's what it is. And Crue really sold the music visually with their Mad Max adjacent leather garb and the music videos they filmed where the band were thrown into absurd, fantastical scenarios portraying them as macho badasses. Shout at the Devil quickly went platinum after its release and opened a lot more doors for the band, including a chaotic, drug-fueled tour where they opened for Ozzy Osbourne that fall. All I'll say about it, I learned while making this video that Ozzy once licked up his own piss and snorted ants from the ground during this tour, and now you have too. Congrats! And in spite of all of that, the spotlight was not entirely on Motley Crue in September. See, just a few days before Shout at the Devil, their old tour mates Kiss totally upstaged them when, in a dramatic televised reveal on MTV, they took off their makeup and embraced glam metal aesthetics. Surprise, motherfuckers, we're doing more Kissery in this video. The MTV appearance was, in fact, a promotional stunt advertising Kiss's newest album, Lick It Up, which would release on September 22nd. In a sign of glam metal's commercial potency by this point, this new aesthetic that Kiss obviously adopted in imitation of Motley Crue, in spite of years of commercial misfires beforehand, is all it took to endear a new generation of listeners to them, leading to Lick It Up going gold in December. Paul Stanley's gone on the record in the decades since, saying that Creatures of the Night was a far better Kiss album than Lick It Up, and that people were clearly listening with their eyes rather than their ears. And I agree to some extent. Creatures is absolutely a lot more consistent than Lick It Up, but there's still some damn solid tunes on the latter, including Exciter, Not for the Innocent, Fits Like a Glove, and, of course, the singles Lick It Up and All Hell's Breakin' Loose. Big shoutouts to Eric Carr, who delivers another killer drum performance, but really should have been given more to do, and Vinnie Vincent, whose guitar solos absolutely thrill. Although, the Hunk Warrior wasn't much longer for Kiss. Remember, Vinnie was a great guitarist, but he was also an overly egotistical one, and in a band with two massive egos driving it already, yeah, he got canned the following March after overextending his live guitar solos one too many times. But screw Gene and Paul anyways, Vinnie was gonna go form his own band, with Blackjack and hookers. But more on them later. Honestly, Kiss were far from the only legacy act, so to speak, pivoting towards a glammier direction by the end of 1983. Ozzy Osbourne had been on the LA scene's fringes since the late 70s in order to poach its guitarists, but it's only arguably with Bark at the Moon, released in November of 1983, that he truly leaned into more of a glam metal sound. I mean, part of that it might be because J.K. Lee wrote a lot of the music on the album, but Ozzy's manager wife Sharon shoved that little factoid under the rug. Sharon! I don't think it's anywhere on the level of something like Blizzard of Oz or Diary of a Madman, but it's got some decent cuts like Rock and Roll Rebel, Center of Eternity, and of course, that title track. There's also Y&T from Oakland, who, since their earlier days in the 70s as Yesterday and Today, had always leaned into a heavy metal sound, but polished their sound even further up with September's Mean Streak. Tunes like the title track, Straight Through the Heart, and Hang 'Em High demonstrate a rockin' tenacity which really explains why this particular album broke through in spite of poor promotion from their label A&M. The future of rock radio was here, and it seemed to be glam. It was at the point where newspaper journalists and critics like Gary Graff were, by the end of the year, finding dinosaur music, far from going extinct, to be back on top. And now some odd bits and bobs to wrap up the year. Dokken got to re-release Breaking the Chains on Elektra in September, complete with a shiny new mix from Michael Wagener, and they even put out the title track as a single complete with a video, though it didn't really go anywhere. It is worth noting, though, that with One Krausier now dedicated to Ratt, the video marks the debut appearance of Dokken's new bassist, Jeff Pilson. Say hi, Jeff.
My name is Jeff.
Steeler, a Nashville band fronted by Ron Keel, which had moved to LA, also put out their debut, only record this year. See, funny story. Steeler signed to an indie label, Shrapnel Records, whose label head Mike Varney had a thing for championing guitar virtuosos, and he'd just managed to bring over on a work visa up-and-coming Swedish guitar wunderkind Yngwie Malmsteen. Malmsteen joined Steeler, and immediately came into conflict with Keel and the others over the band's simplistic glam metal song structures. True to form. They were able to temporarily resolve this tension enough to record that album, but, well... Clearly, that couldn't last, and Malmsteen would soon leave for shreddier pastures, ensuring Steeler's collapse. Let's see, what else? Alan Niven left Green World Distribution by the end of 1983 after they refused to do anything for Great White, so that he could manage them on their own, and credit to Niven, he was able to get their independently released EP on local radio. Although this had the unfortunate side effect of exposing the world to Great White. Bow Wow sadly broke up after a gig at Nakano's Sun Plaza on November 21st. Any other fun little stories? Anyone? Fuck it. I guess we gotta get serious. Def Leppard really stepped in it when, at a gig in Tucson on September 7th, Joe Elliott implored the crowd to sing along to Rock of Ages by yelling at the crowd at their El Paso show, which he referred to as that place with all the greasy Mexicans, was louder. Now, look, Elliott immediately apologized and donated to Latino charities, even if he would try to make his own justifications for the incident later. But this was a stark display of the overwhelming whiteness elevating glam metal to prominence. Remember, this was at a time where black music was still fighting to be heard after the racist backlash to and industry overcorrection for disco fever, and Latino music was hardly taken seriously as a commercial force at all. So record companies and MTV's elevation of largely white glam metal bands, some of whom had subconscious prejudices to work out in spite of their own meager upbringing, was hardly a neutral act. Latino advocacy groups would attempt to boycott Def Leppard for a while, and in fact, El Paso would remain hostile to them into the 21st century, but the industry forces behind Def Leppard ensured that they would remain a powerful market force in the Western world in years to come. But anyways, I think we've had enough by now of 1983. So much happened this year to finally break glam metal worldwide after years of the necessary infrastructure being laid in the musical underground. I only hope, in piecing the timeline together, that I was able to give y'all a decently holistic view of it all. Of course, glam metal hadn't even begun to peak. While 1983 was the grand coming out for the genre, 1984 proved it had far more legs than a mere revivalist rock trend. Now, let's crack this list back open and get to chronicling— Oh shit! Yeah, I'm not gonna lie to y'all, I'm not sure if I'll be able to condense all these albums into a comprehensive chronology, but fuck me, I'll try. Almost on cue, rock bands everywhere started chasing those sweet, sweet glam bucks in 1984, and not just new bands either. Taking cues from Kiss, Whitesnake and the Scorpions would make their own glam pivots in the first half of the year. In the former's case, their Slide It In was a conscious shift away from their bluesier origins towards a more deliberately commercial sound, only further emphasized when the album was remixed for its American release in April by former Sammy Hagar producer Keith Olsen. As for the latter, Love It for Sting released early in the year and quickly became the Scorpions' biggest commercial smash, propelled by flashy rockers, Big City Nights and Rocky Like a Hurricane, and the towering power ballad Still Loving You. Even when there were still legit heavy metal acts out there like Judas Priest or Iron Maiden, they were still out there on the road with their glammy contemporaries and giving them new opportunities. Keep in mind, the 80s were still a time where heavy metal was loosely defined. It was not until late into the decade that we had far more extreme variants of metal that truly delineate metal subgenres. Granted, there were metal fans at the time who despised the commercialism and aesthetic of glam and wanted to draw that line in the sand already, but we'll get to them next time. Glam metal began in 1984 as king, and it was heralded in by two of its eventual most successful artists. In the first place, John Bon Jovi's band, now signed to Mercury Records and managed by Doc McGee, put out their debut on January 9th under the moniker Bon Jovi. Because poor literacy is
anti-Italian discrimination.
Bon Jovi's debut is decent, but really Runaway is the only obvious highlight, one that just barely became the band's first hit by cracking the Billboard Top 40. More importantly, though, was the release of Van Halen's newest album in almost 2 years, one which took Eddie Van Halen's synth experimentation to newer, greater heights, one which confirmed Van Halen as the leaders of the pack, the reigning kings of not just Los Angeles heavy metal, but the rising tide of glam metal as well. I am, of course, talking about 1984, released on January 9th that same year. Spurned by his negative experience working on Diver Down, Eddie decided the following year to construct a studio in his backyard with Don Landy, where he could record what he wanted away from David Lee Roth and Ted Templeman. He named it 5150 Studios. Why? Well, it's named after Section 5150 of the California Welfare and Institutions Code, which allows officers to place someone in an involuntary psychiatric hold if, due to mental disorders, they were a danger to themselves or others. And I know Eddie probably meant it as a cheeky, look at me, I'm crazy Eddie thing, but make sure you're looking out for your mental health, y'all. Anyways, after 3 months of recording, the longest Van Halen had spent on recording to date, they not only had the usual slate of barn burners, but a handful of synth-centered tunes. Once again, Templeman and Roth weren't too thrilled with the synth tracks, although there was one commercial titan among them immediately begging for further elaboration and proper development.
That was Jump. Once Ted heard that song, he was full hog in. He said, "That's great, let's go to work." When I first played Jump for the band, nobody wanted to have anything to do with it. Dave said that I was a guitar hero and I shouldn't be playing keyboards. My response was, if I want to play a tuba or Bavarian cheese whistle, I'll do it. As soon as Ted was on board with Jump and said that it was a stone cold hit, everyone started to like it more. But Ted really only cared about Jump. He didn't care much about the rest of the record. He just wanted that one hit.
And you know what? Even with how this song has been overplayed to death on the radio in the 4 decades since, Jump still whips. Alex Van Halen's simple backbeat pairs well with the electrifying tone of Eddie's Oberheim synth to create one hell of a summer earworm. And that's all before the obligatory Eddie Van Halen guitar solo. Eventually, at Templeman's request, Roth begrudgingly obliged to contribute lyrics, and in conversation with a roadie, decided to write something of an exhortation to make the most of life and its thrills. Quite the departure from the tragic circumstances that inspired him.
Do a flip!
So yeah, Jump, fantastic song, fantastic single, but the other singles that came out of the album were also titanic. Hot for Teacher is bar none the most scorching translation of schoolboy fantasy into rock and roll fun I've ever heard. All Wait, even if I don't personally like its synth patterns that much, is a unique lyrical collaboration with one of Ted Templeman's other music friends, Michael McDonald, and Panama, well, come on, it's Panama. Nah, let me try that again. It's motherfucking... Even the deep cuts on the album, Pop Jimmy, Drop Dead Legs, Girl Gone Bad, House of Pain, fucking kill. 1984 rules, and pretty much everyone back in 1984 the year felt the same way. It got a 4 out of 5 in Rolling Stone, peaked at number 2 on the Billboard album charts behind Thriller, went platinum by March, produced 3 top 40 hits including a number 1 in Jump, and spawned wildly successful American and European tours with absurd lighting rigs. Van Halen were still kings, but unfortunately, the palace intrigue behind the scenes between Dave and Eddie would only continue to worsen throughout the year. February finally marked the major label debut of Ratt, with the release of Out of the Cellar on the 17th. Full disclosure, this is my favorite glam metal album of all time. Even though the bands didn't really want to work with Beau Hill, nor for that matter did Beau Hill think that he could pull off a production job on this scale, they managed to somehow develop a working relationship on the same level as Van Halen and Ted Templeman, in my opinion. The songwriting and instrumentals on this album are on their own stunning. Continuing on from the EP, Ratt strengthened their knack for sleazy, cocky lyrics and dual guitar leads. But it's Beau Hill's reverb-laden production that really sells them, makes it all sound like they recorded live at an arena and not just at Sound City. There are so many underrated deep cuts in this one. For example, You're in Trouble, In Your Direction, The Morning After, and especially Scene of the Crime. But the singles are also just legendary. Wanted Man, Lack of Communication, and the re-recorded Back for More are all brimming with life and swagger. But the real feature attraction here is, of course, Round and Round. The perfect combination of iconic riffs, snide Stephen Pearcy vocals, and catchy choruses, Round and Round was Ratt's breakthrough song, hitting number 12 on the Billboard charts thanks, in part, to a fun music video prominently featuring Milton Berle, uncle of the band's manager, A. Alan Kaufman, B. Doc McGee, C. Alan Niven, D. Marshall Burrell. If you guessed D, congrats! Told y'all there'd be a test. Interestingly, Round and Round was my very first exposure to glam metal. Remember the grim adventures of Billy and Mandy? They had a Christmas special where Santa got turned into a vampire, and at the end of it, Round and Round was played during the credits. This was before I got into rock music through Guitar Hero even, so I was just like, wow, this music goes harder than Grant Kirkhope. But anyways, thank you Maxwell Adams, Ratt's Out of the Cellar was a smash success and would hit platinum certification by August, establishing Ratt as one of the upcoming glam metal acts to look out for. Also significant this month is that Def Leppard began to demo their follow-up to Pyromania in Dublin. They were quite giddy at their burgeoning stardom in America, perhaps a bit too giddy. The band spent most of their first month in Ireland drinking, Joe Elliott drunkenly bought himself a Rolex, and apparently Rick Allen would spend a shit ton of time smoking weed and listening to Billy Idol's Rebel Yell. Man, if I ever hit it big doing what I love and have a solid chunk of change under me, that's where I want to be. Patreon.com/ResiOrenji. From the start, the boys were looking to double down on their embrace of pop. Not content to lose out to another thriller like Mega Smash, the boys and Mutt Lange began to conceptualize Pyromania 2 as a rock version of Thriller, where every song had potential crossover appeal and could be a single. Taking more after Duran Duran and The Fix at this point than, say, Deep Purple and Motorhead, they were clearly content to leave their metal past even further behind them. Only problem for them was that Mutt Lange, coming off of an absolutely stacked run of blockbuster albums, was feeling exhausted by 1984 and would not commit to producing Pyromania 2. Instead, the job fell to none other than Jim Goddamn Steinman of Meatloaf fame. On the one hand, it does kinda make sense. Steinman was a proven hitmaker by this point. On the other, I'm not sure these guys are gonna want his sorta hits. We'll get back to them. March was largely empty of glam metal albums, though there was one major band who'd made their own shameless pivot into metal territory that had a documentary in theaters on the 2nd. Now, you might be thinking, a heavy metal documentary in major American theater chains in 1984? This is madness! Madness. No. This is Spinal Tap! I'm sure this film needs no introduction to rock devotees, but for those of you less initiated, This is Spinal Tap is a mockumentary directed by Rob Reiner that follows the eponymous Spinal Tap, a 5-piece English rock group attempting to promote their latest album, Smell the Glove, on an American concert tour that goes horribly wrong through a series of wild antics and interband tensions. It's a fucking hilarious classic of a film that gave birth to so many unforgettable jokes turned rock aphorisms.
Hello, Cleveland! Hello, Cleveland!
The review you had on Shark Sandwich, which was merely a 2-word review, just said, shit sandwich.
Something about this that's so black. It's like, how much more black could this be? And the answer is none. None
Is that good?
more black.
Why don't you just make 10 louder and make 10 be the top number and make that a little louder?
These go to 11.
But so much of it, the pivoting to different commercially profitable genres, the cycling through multiple different genres, the breakdown of touring logistics, rang true to metal band's own experiences. Apparently when he saw it, George Lynch was like, "That's us! How'd they make a movie about us?" Ozzy apparently completely thought it was a documentary of a real band when watching it for the first time, and he was probably like, "Ah, yeah, Cucumber the Pants, that tracks," and he didn't laugh. If anything, he was disappointed that they weren't crazier. Importantly for our story, though, This Is Spinal Tap was a hit at the box office, grossing over $4 million on a $2 million budget. Yet more proof heavy metal's commercial penetration was surging. We're gonna skip ahead a bit to May real quick. There are some things I want to come back to later when they're more relevant, you'll see. 2 significant albums dropped this month, and you know what they say, ladies first. Well, actually the other album came out first, but I'm talking about how I prefer to cover them. Lita Ford dropped another album on May 28th called Dancin' on the Edge. It's basically a more commercial version of its predecessor, prominently featuring powerful background harmonies and keyboards like any other album aping Pyromania at the time. Lita still contributes some great riffs and leads here, especially on tracks like Dress to Kill and Run with the Money, but her songwriting game doesn't sound as inspired as it did on the debut. The album did better commercially than the debut, but as a woman in glam metal, Lita was going to need to cook with gas to really break through into the mainstream. The real smash hit of the month was Twisted Sister's Stay Hungry, released on the 10th. Tom Werman, hot off his success with Shadow the Devil, was pegged to produce for Sister this time by Atlantic producer Doug Morris, who wanted to finally break Twisted Sister in America. Only thing is, the band, or more specifically Dee Snider, fucking hated Werman. According to Dee, Werman was against Snider's more anthemic tunes and wanted the band to sound closer to Saxon. Snider, once again, was in the position of having to argue for anthems that those above him saw as childish. As he recalled about one in particular, "I remember Tom sitting in a folding chair in the studio, and I'm on one knee because I'm trying to talk in his ear. I'm going, 'Tom, trust me.' He goes, 'It's so like a kid's song.' I said, 'It's gonna be more aggressive when we record it.' And literally he says, 'I don't care. If you want it on the record that bad, fine.'" And that, folks, is how we ended up with one of the most iconic songs about rage over the status quo ever written. We're Not Gonna Take It. Subjectively speaking, I think the song is mid when you hold it up against the rest of the band's discography, but objectively speaking, it was built to be a hit. The intro mirroring Come On Feel the Noise, the nursery rhyme simplicity of the melody, the empathy with youth who are looked down upon, that's a certified rock hit if I've ever heard one. And it was. Even before its music video dropped, it was lighting up radio waves. After the music video dropped,
I want to rock.
to paraphrase Dee Snider, it was like adding rocket boosters to a hot rod. That video, as well as the one for I Wanna Rock, finally busted the door down for Twisted Sister, whose rowdy makeup antics were a perfect fit for the music video format. Let's get lost in the images, though. Stay Hungry, the album itself, is incredible. In addition to the anthems, there are more Saxon-esque tracks in the title track and Don't Let Me Down, a ballad in The Price, and even sludgier Sabbathy tracks like the Captain Howdy bit of Horrorteria and The Beast. I'm not sure which is my favorite Twisted Sister album between this one and Under the Blade, but Stay Hungry absolutely deserved its success. Off the backs of its MTV videos, the album went platinum and brought Twisted Sister to their greatest commercial heights. Conversely, it was kinda a double-edged sword in that now the band's cartoon character antics came to define them more than their actual music. Apparently, Dee Snider realized something was off as soon as he got a fan letter from a 14-year-old girl listing Twisted Sister as one of her favorite bands, along with Duran Duran and Kaja Goo Goo. Oh god, it's like Kiss on the Dynasty tour all over again. And actually, around the same time, Quiet Riot were beginning to falter themselves. You see, Kevin DeBro, for all his grinding in the past few years to get Quiet Riot to the top, had a bit of an ego to him. He regularly slagged off their contemporaries in the press, even said Ozzy Osbourne sounded like a frog, which Rudy Sarzo ended up getting decked by his former bandleader for. They were also being teased by their contemporaries, most notably Nikki Sixx, by hitting it big with a cover song, to which Rudy Sarzo fired back essentially saying, "What, jealous you couldn't hit it big with Helter Skelter?" DeBro's bandmates had to do so much damage control, all while he stewed further in his own drug addictions and jealousy of the seeming overnight success newer glam bands were seeing. Dee Snider actually has a pretty telling DeBro anecdote from the time related to that. Kevin DeBro once said to me, we were having dinner together, "Don't you hate that these fucking bands, all these fucking bands, they're together a couple of years, they get a deal, and they have an album, and they're out on tour? Don't you fucking hate that?" I looked at him and I said, "Are you kidding, Kevin? I wouldn't wish what we went through on my worst enemy." He was shocked by my saying that. I go, "It took the fucking joy out of it for me." Perhaps a little arrogant in the belief that they'd finally found a winning formula after years in the wilderness, Quiet Riot essentially made their follow-up effort to Metal Health, Condition Critical, a doppelganger album. Released on July 27th, the album essentially came together immediately after the Metal Health tour per the label's request, and consequently, yeah, it's pretty damn boring. You know you're out of ideas when the highlight of the album is another damn Slade cover, this time of Mama We're All Crazy Now. There are decent cuts here or there, like Sign of the Times and Party All Night, but even then there's like typically 1 or 2 minutes you could hack off of most of the tracks and they'd have that much more staying power for it. And then there's also a lot of little weird creative decisions they made scattered throughout the album. Like, why did they decide to call back to Bang Your Head only a year later on Stomp Your Hands, Clap Your Feet? Why the hell did they enunciate the T so hard in Party All Night? I'm not sure you'd call it a train record or whatever, but Condition Critical was just a middling glam metal album, and in a year where glam metal was continuing to break into the mainstream, it got left in the dust commercially, only going platinum while Metal Health had sold 6 million copies. Critically, it was reviled. An infamous review in Musician by J.D. Considine simply read, "Prognosis Terminal." Only months later in the Pittsburgh press, Rudy Sarzo would reflect on the band's diminished returns, likening the album's failure that year to giving ice cream to a kid who'd eaten a ton of it since they had their first taste of it a year ago, while remaining optimistic about the band's future. In truth, though, tensions brewed behind the scenes between DeBro and the rest of the band as they were now put into the position of having to fight to stay relevant. Whoa, though, I think we need to reorient ourselves here back to the summer of '84 because we've jumped around quite a bit chronology-wise just now. Why not return to Japan? Pun not intended. Loudness, by this point, had been trucking for a few years and had put out 2 more albums, 1983's The Law of Devil's Land and 1984's Disillusion, both solid albums in their own right. What's interesting about the latter is that it was recorded over in London at Trevor Horn's SARM Studios. Around this time, they were getting more attention from overseas audiences. After The Law of Devil's Land released, they apparently did a small tour of California in the summer of '83, before heading over to Europe in the fall and again the following summer. By that point, Loudness's international reputation had grown to the point where American metalheads were willingly buying imported Loudness records and record executives were beginning to take notice. Striking while the iron was hot, they dropped an English version of Disillusion in July for the international market, which sold... Well, there's no info on how it sold, but by that point, there was so much buzz surrounding them that they got signed by Atco Records that May. Minoru Nihara, get ready to learn English, buddy. Japanese metal in general was on the up. 44 Magnum and Earthshaker earnestly began releasing their own music. Groups like Seikimatsu and X emerged too, influenced in part by both Kabuki Theater and Kiss, pushed the hair and makeup associated with glam metal to extreme degrees, and female-fronted metal acts like Mari Hamada and Shoya steadily carved a niche for themselves. Even Bow Wow benefited from this growing curiosity for Japanese metal. Though they broke up, it was really only Mitsuhiro Saito who wanted to leave. Yamamoto, Sano, and Nimi continued on under the name Bow Wow, because a bunch of British kids had come along recently, taken their old name and essentially slapped another wow on it, and added Genki Hitomi on vocals and Rei Atsumi on keys. This new group would go on to record an album, Beat of Metal Motion, and release it on September 21st. It's pretty good, though it's a massive pivot in sound towards more keys-based metal away from the guitar-focused wizardry of the Bow Wow era. Breakdown, Diamond Night, and Mask of Flesh Masquerade are a few rockin' highlights that show off well Atsumi's virtuosity and Hitomi's husky, Bolton-esque belt, but I don't know, they sound a lot more like Night Ranger now than their own distinct thing. I haven't been able to find anything on how the album did commercially, but it was at least successful enough to attract the attention of Toshiba EMI, who quickly scooped them up from Bow Wow's old label, VAP. A new era of Japanese metal was about to begin, one which mirrored the growing acceptance of a variety of metal in the West, but with growing mainstream interest in pop metal. Meanwhile, back in Los Angeles, business was booming. The city had more eyes on it than ever before, perhaps, this summer. In mainstream music presses, Los Angeles was being hyped up as the place to be if you loved metal. Remember, Axl Rose, Izzy Stradlin, Ron Keel, and all of Poison had already moved out there from across the country in search of stardom, with plenty others to come. Local bands vying for fame continued to crop up as well. After LA Guns and Hollywood Rose came Jet Boy, who came from San Francisco, and Warrant, a band literally named because its members loved Warren DeMartini from Ratt. However, LA wasn't just hopping because of the glam metal explosion of the previous year, but because it was now hosting the Summer Olympics. Even before the games began on July 28th, the city hosted a 10-week-long Olympic Arts Festival hosting music, dance, and theater troupes from around the world. The centennial festivities of 1981 had prepped the city well for such international attention, and, in fact, the use of pre-existing stadiums and corporate funding allowed it to actually profit from the Olympics when all was said and done. The U.S. Olympic delegation dominated, taking home a whopping 174 medals. Against a boycott-affected competition, granted, but still. You might look at all this activity and think it exciting, and it certainly was to some extent. But bubbling just underneath the surface, both citywide and within the glam scene, were tensions threatening to make daily life harder. In the first place, let's talk a bit more about those Olympics. You see, Los Angeles' housing crisis had grown only worse as job opportunities shrunk, and with the Olympics looming, the growing homeless population was sure to paint Los Angeles in a bad light to international guests. So what did Mayor Bradley and the city government do to help the homeless then? Well, in the 2 years leading up to the games, LA City Council basically made it illegal to live on the streets, including in a car or on a bench. In the weeks leading up to the games, LAPD went on an arresting spree, liberally rounding up homeless people and prostitutes to clean the streets. Thanks to federal funding, the LAPD were able to purchase all sorts of military-grade equipment. Bulletproof helicopter armor, flashbang grenades, ballistic helmets, armored vehicles, high-powered binoculars, and much, much more. And fast-tracked the training of scores of police officers for the games, all of which they got to keep and expand upon in decades to come. Mickey Finn of Jet Boy explicitly recalls multiple times after they made their move where cops in flak vests and helicopters would raid the cheap Hollywood hotel they called home. As well, Ricky Rocket also remembers a time where Poison were threatened by gangs in the cheap laundromat they called home, only to be saved by cops, in spite of their own blatant theft from local construction sites. As for the glam scene itself, it was encountering some growing pains. Even though LA Guns and Hollywood Rose had both recorded demos by early 1984, the latter very quickly fell apart after Chris Weber accidentally clocked Axl in the face with his guitar's headstock, and you can probably guess what happened next. Disillusioned and beginning to sink into drug addiction, Izzy Stradlin quit and joined London, who still had not signed to a record label somehow. Axl did try to continue on with a young guitarist named Saul Hudson, or Slash for short, and his drummer friend Steven Adler, but Lil Slash couldn't even keep his own band going, let alone commit to another entirely, so Axl left to join LA Guns after their vocalist Mike Jagaj got the boot. Additionally, some newer metal bands didn't quite have the sauce, but still found success. For one, there was Autograph, a group of LA studio musicians that lucked into opening for Van Halen on their 1984 tour, scored a hit with Turn Up the Radio, and had their debut Sign In Please certified gold for it. I won't cover them too in depth because Todd in the Shadows already did that perfectly with that one-hit Wonderland video of his, but suffice it to say that despite how much fun Turn Up the Radio is, Autograph was never much more than a platform for guitarist Steve Lynch to promote his instructional guides. There was also Black and Blue, who finally released their Dieter Dierks-produced self-titled this year, and it's very middle of the road for a glam band, like a lesser Dokken almost, but their single Hold On to 18 apparently scored some success on MTV. The kings of bad glam metal, however, were none other than Poison. It's fucking hilarious to me reading through my research that pretty much everyone hated Poison. Musicians, record executives, even their own managers had some critiques. And yet still, through relentless promotion that involved flyer pasting, show theming, and treating fat and ugly women like actual people and not bad lays, they actually built their own legion of devoted fans. As future rocker Tie Me Down would put it, music was like 5% of the reason that you went to see Poison, with the remaining 85% being the women and the booze. Lest we get too bogged down in negatives though, there was still some quality hair metal emerging from Los Angeles in the back half of the year. Wasp finally released their debut record this year on Capitol Records, and even if it didn't do much to recreate the chaotic intensity of their live show, it's still damn solid and loaded with anthems and vulgarity in equal measure. I Want to Be Somebody, the lead-off track, should have been a far bigger deal than it ended up being in America, in my opinion. It's on the level of We're Not Gonna Take It, but far, far better. The rest of the album is also pretty impressive. A lot of it, like Love Machine and On Your Knees, takes the sexual innuendo and groove of late 70s Kiss and cranks them up to the max, while others, like The Flame and Sleeping in the Fire, burn red hot. Pun fully intended. And Blackie Lawless's voice on this, good god, he's like a wild beast. Speaking of, there was actually a song intended to be on the album called Fuck Like a Beast, but at the last second, the label balked, kept it off the album, and only released it as a single in the UK. It seems ridiculous to us now in a post-Nine Inch Nails world, but they really were scared of triggering some sort of moral outrage. Hell, I'm sure they'll be fine. Dokken, meanwhile, finally released their sophomore album, Tooth and Nail, on September 14th. And folks, it's a miracle this one came out at all. After the failure of the re-release Breaking the Chains, Cliff Bernstein managed to convince Elektra to give Dokken one more shot, this time with a big-name producer guiding them. Tom Werman, hot off his success with Stay Hungry, was pegged to produce by Bernstein. By this point, he'd already dealt with sex and drugs in the studio and obstinate frontman, but nothing in the world could have prepared him for the burning hatred between Don Dokken and George Lynch. Whereas Dokken was itching to write more sentimental songs, including ballads, Lynch was far more about balls-to-the-wall metal, and this escalated into multiple shouting matches in the studio between the two. Meanwhile, they had Jeff Workman, a sound engineer who was addicted to coke and alcohol to such an extent that he made sentence-mixing shitposts mocking Worman in his off hours, working with them, and according to Mick Brown, Werman himself wasn't that helpful to the band either. Eventually, Werman left the project outright when a suggestion to Lynch to change a guitar solo escalated into a screaming match. Dokken was like, "Hey, maybe we can get my friend Michael Wagener in." "No!" screamed the rest of the band in unison, but ultimately Wagener was brought on, along with Queen producer Roy Thomas Baker, to salvage the album. And you know what? It all worked out in the end. Tooth and Nail is a fantastic album back to front. From the opening salvo of the title track, to the menacing riff of When Heaven Comes Down, to the melodic bliss of its singles, Just Got Lucky, Into the Fire, and Alone Again. Funny story, George Lynch hated Alone Again and had to be convinced to let it on the album. That said, when the album was out and it was lagging considerably in sales, it wasn't any of Lynch's tunes that reversed that trend, but Alone Again. Would not be surprised if that became one of Don's talking points in their future arguments. But I think we've spent enough time in LA for a while. Shall we head back out east? Not for any actual Eastern US glam bands, no, but for Hanoi Rocks' 5th album, Two Steps from the Move, which they got to record in New York and Toronto with... oh no. No! Bob Ezrin, the acclaimed producer behind such rock classics as Alice Cooper's Billion Dollar Babies, Pink Floyd's The Wall, and Kiss's Destroyer, and music from The Elder, was then coming off of a cocaine addiction which had plagued him and his work for the past few years when he heard of this flashy young band out of Finland playing in the UK. Flying out there in November '83 to see them play in Bristol, Ezrin was impressed with Hanoi Rocks and agreed to produce their new album in December. That winter, Ezrin employed his old tactics that he used for other bands, namely bringing in outside songwriters and employing strict discipline in the studio. And though the Finns, and singular Brit, bristled at his attitude at first, they'd later admit that they needed someone like him to come kick their ass and show them a thing or two. And, judging by the results of the final product, I'd say they made the right choice going with Ezrin. Two Steps from the Move is my favorite Hanoi Rocks album, layered with all sorts of bells and whistles to bring them closer to the larger-than-life arena sound American rock was angling for at the time. That, paired with their typical sleazy lyricism, elevates tracks like Underwater World, Boiler, Me Boiler and Me, and Futurama. My favorite track on the album, though, definitely has got to be High School. It's got some fun riffs, cheeky lyrics about getting revenge on lame teachers by becoming a cooler teacher, and a neat 7/8 break so obvious you get the impression Bob Ezrin put the band through music theory boot camp like he did Kiss. Overall, Two Steps is a solid album, and the American public agreed. 2 weeks after release, it had sold 44,000 copies stateside. Not a bad start to the Finnish band's conquest of the States. In the back half of 1984, older bands continued to either pivot themselves to a glam sound or lean harder into the sound they'd adopted. In the case of the former, Swiss band Crocus finally broke through in America thanks to the Blitz. No, goddammit, the album! Presumably it was named after the cover of Ballroom Blitz they did on the album, which, in true glam metal band fashion, they released as a single. Funny enough, though, the charting single of the album was actually Midnight Maniac, which demonstrates perfectly the more glammed-up direction the band were taking. Mark Storis is a lot more restrained in his vocal, with prominent background vocals backing him up, while the backing instruments are a bit more clean. Most notable, though, is the fact that Bruce Fairbairn, fresh off his work with Loverboy and Blue Oyster Cult, was gaining even more experience behind the boards of a glam metal act. I'll say this much for the Blitz: for as much of it feels just okay, the production is definitely impressive. Y&T also doubled down on their glam turn with In Rock We Trust, released sometime in July. The whole album is so earnestly corny and on the nose in its subject matter. Look no further than Rock and Roll's Gonna Save the World. But the riffs are big and Dave Menichetti is shrieking his ass off. It's a fun album, and I totally understand why it became Y&T's highest charting album yet. Same with Sammy Hagar and his July 23rd release, VOA. It actually wasn't Hagar's first attempt at a glammier album this year. He'd gotten together for a few gigs the previous fall with his bassist Kenny Aronson and Neil Schon and Michael Shreve of Santana, which were recorded, polished, and released under the decent supergroup effort Hagar, Schon, Aronson, Shreve. VOA was far more successful, though, thanks to the defiant bravado of its signature single, I Can't Drive, which, yes, the Minutemen would later kind of roast him for, but it hit number 26 at its Billboard peak and propelled the album to eventual platinum certification. The red rocker and glam metal seemed a natural fit. And then there's Kiss's Animalize, which dropped on September 17th. After Vinnie Vincent got the boot, Kiss were quick to bring in a new guitarist, Mark St. John, who was a virtual unknown plucked right from the LA cover circuit. He was just as talented as Vinnie, contributing a number of killer leads on Animalize. Unfortunately for Gene and Paul, he was also as egotistical as Vinnie. Hell, maybe even worse. St. John's feuding with the band was so bad that even Eric Carr wanted to kill the guy. Eric fucking Carr, the man with the patience of a saint for Gene and Paul's bullshit. And Gene in particular was contributing a lot of bullshit at this time. Not only was he earnestly pursuing an acting career, starring in that year's Runaway for his first major motion picture, that wasn't made for TV, but he was also getting more involved in music management and production. Apparently, he discovered Cinderella in Philadelphia that year and offered to manage them. But only if they started playing some Gene Simmons original compositions, which were utter dog shit, so they refused. And you know, that all really speaks to why Simmons was contributing just clunker lyrics at this time, like the log-in fireplace innuendo and Burn Bitch Burn. Paul ultimately had to bring in outside contributors to help write the album, like old friends of the band Desmond Child and Mitch Weissman, and the Plasmatics' John Beauvoir. Somehow, though, it all kinda came together. I mean, Animalize is actually pretty damn good. The entire first side is loaded with hard riffs and heavy drumming that puts Eric Carr to good use, and the second, while slightly weaker, definitely shows Kiss embracing a less edgy glam image in stuff like Thrills in the Night. I mean, as though that wasn't obvious from the leopard print aesthetic on the cover. Still, good album overall, and the public actually agreed. That December, for the first time since Dynasty 5 years ago, a Kiss studio album went platinum. A testament to the commercial strength of glam metal, if not to the actual strength of Kiss's band chemistry at that point. And now, as with last year, some other bits and bobs that I found notable but couldn't really work naturally into everything else. Pantera put out their second album, Projects in the Jungle, in July, and it's definitely an improvement from their debut, even if it is largely just a Def Leppard sound-alike, what with Terry Glaze shrieking his ass off. Two bands, Great White and Phoenix, Arizona's Icon, made their major label debuts this year, but completely tanked. Icon were given one more chance, while Great White, even though they did chart, were completely dropped by EMI. But hey, at least that's better than what happened to White Lion, who'd gotten signed to Elektra and recorded their debut by early 1984, but then suddenly Elektra balked at releasing it and just dropped them altogether. Thanks, Bob Krasnow. Things did not end up working out between Def Leppard and Jim Steinman. Apparently Steinman was way too theatrical-minded for the band, distracted with his own ideas, and more concerned about changing the studio carpets than guiding the band properly, so they paid him $300,000 for him to fuck off. Ron Keel formed a new band for Shrapnel named Keel, with David Michael Phillips and Mark Ferrari on guitar, Bobby Marks on drums, and Kenny Chason on bass guitar. Now, Phillips would soon be poached by Carmen Appice for his newest band, and Marks would leave soon after their debut album released in November, but for what it's worth, the album's got some solid rock without all the distracting widdly-widdlying from Malmsteen. And Gene Simmons seemed to think so too, offering to produce their next album, which came out only 2 months later. Jesus Christ, that turnaround. But again, to get serious, not all was well in Glamtown, and that was perhaps no better displayed than through the shit show that had gone down behind the scenes during the 1984 Monsters of Rock festival in August. On the surface, it seems like an incredible bill. Motley Crue, Accept, Y&T, Gary Moore, Ozzy Osbourne, Van Halen, and AC/DC? Fuck me. However, by that point, Motley Crue had been spending multiple months on the road, cementing their reputation as hellraisers. Every time they stayed at a hotel, they would call Doc McGee to put them down for whatever shit they broke in their rooms. They did a shit ton of drugs, drank a shit ton of booze, and slept with a shit ton of women. Some, perhaps, not so consensually. They were quickly becoming Flanderized versions of themselves, unable to really put down the flashy, macho rock star personas they'd come to embody. They still played a killer set at Donington, by all accounts, until Nicky Sixx threw his bass into the crowd and seriously injured a fan. Still, they were allowed on the subsequent tour through Europe with most of the other bands. Until apparently at some multi-band dinner before a show in Sweden, Vince Neil bit Eddie Van Halen, sparking a fist fight in which apparently Malcolm Young got bit by Tommy Lee as well. The bands and their managers were pissed and demanded Crue be kicked off the tour, but at that point they were so popular that it wasn't so simple. A compromise was reached. They'd spend their time before gigs backstage in a trailer raised off the ground with a crane, and after gigs, they'd go the fuck right back to their hotel room. It was a hell of a reversal after David Lee Roth's so profoundly championed Crue back in the day, and was a clear sign, perhaps, that the hard and fast lifestyle so many of these rock stars were living was unsustainable. By the end of 1984, glam metal as a genre was cemented as a mainstream force, but even now, at this early stage, its volatility and licentiousness brought its leading band's futures into question. Two car crashes at the end of 1984, in fact, serve as a solid dividing point between the scrappy, young innocence of the glam metal movement as it had existed until then, and everything that would come after. In the first place, there was the one in Redondo Beach, California on December 8, 1984. Hanoi Rocks had had a decently successful debut tour of America for the past few months, playing in a bunch of mid-level venues and even selling out 2 shows in New York City. However, in Syracuse, Michael Monroe accidentally slipped on some spilt beer and twisted his ankle, prompting the band to cancel a few dates while he recovered. In the interim, they decided to fly out in early December to California, where their next gigs were scheduled to be, including their LA debut, and party it up for a few days. And who else was there but Motley Crue to throw a welcoming party for the Finnish glam punks? The following night, the 2 bands minus Monroe were living it up at Vince Neil's home in Redondo Beach, drinking and drugging as they'd done separately multiple times in the past, when all of a sudden, they realized they were out of beer. "No matter," Vince Neil presumably said. "I'll just head out in my 672 Ford Pantera and get some more. Come on, Razzle." And so the 2 sped down a few blocks to the local liquor store, their fellow bandmates not nearly in sound enough mind to object. They weren't worried at all, until an hour later. The pair hadn't returned. Worried, Andy McCoy, Tommy Lee, and Hanoi Rocks' road manager went looking for them. They didn't have to drive long before they passed a car wreck on the side of the road, and just as the passengers were debating the color of Vince's fancy car, Andy spotted it. Razzle's hat lying on the side of the road. What had happened was, according to the police report, just down the esplanade, Neil lost control of the car when he swerved around a truck through a wet zone at 65 miles per hour in a 25 mile per hour zone. His beautiful sports car that he wanted to show off plowed right into oncoming traffic, striking 2 other cars. In all, there were a few casualties. Neil himself suffered some light injuries, and the VW67 he collided into had 2 passengers, Lisa Morgan, who was placed into a coma for a month, and Daniel Smithers, who suffered a broken leg and brain damage. Worst of all, though, Razzle wasn't moving. By the time McCoy and the others arrived, he was being loaded into an ambulance and Neil was in cuffs. At 7:12 p.m., Nicholas Charles Razzle Dingley was pronounced dead at South Bay Hospital. He had died on impact, in fact. No pain. Andy McCoy was the one who had to identify Razzle's mangled body for the hospital and had to call his manager to tell the rest of his band because he was too shaken. Meanwhile, Neil, who clocked in well above the legal blood alcohol level in the breathalyzer and wasn't even wearing a seatbelt, was arrested for drunk driving and vehicular manslaughter. He was released on a $2,500 bond, but hey, it seems like a pretty open and shut case. Surely the actual trial will render some actual justice. Well, he was convicted of his charges, but he only served 20 days in jail, paying out $26 million in compensation to the other victims, doing 200 days in community service, and attending classes on the dangers of drugs and alcohol for the rest of his punishment. As Vince himself has reflected,
I wrote a $2.5 million check for vehicular manslaughter when Razzle died. I should have gone to prison. I definitely deserve to go to prison. But I did 30 days in jail and got laid and drank beer because that's the power of cash. That's fucked up.
I'm sorry, but I absolutely cannot buy that remorse for a second. If he really was so repentant for his reckless behavior that night, then why didn't he just accept doing the requisite jail time instead of paying off the victims of the crash whose lives he only irrevocably altered instead of ended? Why has he never apologized to Andy McCoy or Hanoi Rocks for killing their friend? Matter of fact, Nikki Sixx has said that they regularly drove drunk prior to this point. Only now had they gotten unlucky enough for their malignant idiocy to actually kill someone, and even then they'd gotten off light. Certainly far more light than the groups the LAPD regularly targeted for far less. Hanoi Rocks were dealt a serious blow with Razzle's death. Not only did it cripple their recent American momentum, but their close friend of the past 2 years had been taken from them in an instant. They canceled the remainder of their American shows and retreated back to London, spirits crushed. There were 2 more gigs still scheduled for the beginning of the new year in Finland, though, which they were to retool into tributes to Razzle. The second major accident we've got to talk about happened on New Year's Eve, somewhere in the Sheffield countryside. Def Leppard, by this point, were figuring out how to move on from Jim Steinman with their old sound engineer Nigel Green. Because progress moved slowly, though, there was a lot of downtime for the band. It was during this period when, on the 31st, Rick Allen and his girlfriend were driving through the Sheffield countryside in his C4 Corvette. Suddenly, an Alfa Romeo appeared ahead of Allen and then stubbornly refused to let him pass, peeving the young drummer. Eventually, Allen just said fuck it and decided to floor the gas to pass the car, only for a sharp turn to suddenly reveal itself. The rest was a blur. Allen's seatbelt somehow came undone in the chaos, catching his left arm in the process. He was then tossed through the sunroof yards away. Tensed up from shock, Allen still realized one thing very quickly. His arm was gone. Thankfully, an off-duty cop and nurse happened to be nearby to call an ambulance. Allen was rushed to the hospital, arm in tow, and fortunately they were able to reattach it. Unfortunately, because the arm had gotten infected, it had to be amputated. For good. The loss of a limb can be devastating in any profession, but especially so for musicians, given that so many instruments require 2 hands to play. At only 21 years of age, Rick Allen was suddenly at risk of losing his career. His bandmates were notified immediately of these circumstances and traveled up to Sheffield as soon as they could to see him. As Phil Collen recalled about his reaction at the time,
Holy fuck. Rick was just 21 years old. We'd just come off this wild tour, and we're getting ready for the new album. Thoughts were spinning in my head. Rick was glad to be alive, but he also lived for drumming. How'd he survive this? Physically, he'd probably be okay, but emotionally, how would a 21-year-old rock star handle it?
Meanwhile, in Finland, what remained of Hanoi Rocks had gathered along with former Clash drummer Terry Chimes to make good on those 2 Finnish shows on the 3rd and 4th at Helsinki Kultuuritalo. It was hardly without additional loss. Sami Jaffa handed in his resignation notice on the 2nd, tired of the reckless, hedonistic adventurism the band had undergone in the past few years. But he at least agreed to play the final 2 gigs with them. As it happens, though, Hanoi Rocks made the most of these gigs, televising selections from them under the label of Europe A Go-Go. The broadcast would apparently be seen by hundreds of millions of people worldwide, which is nothing to sneeze at for a rowdy bunch of Finnish glam punks. Watching the footage back of the broadcast, especially their performance of Million Miles Away, which they specifically dedicated to Razzle, it's rough. Not musically, they play it fine enough, but just emotionally, the band looked drained. Michael Monroe looked straight up distraught, his mascara barely holding together over his tear-stained eyes. And yet, they still had plans to soldier on. They still had a new album out that they wanted to sell after all. They just needed a little break and a new bassist is all, that's right. And still, the crash that killed their drummer continued to haunt them, much as the one in Sheffield now haunted Def Leppard's future.
Arriving in London a couple of weeks later, we were nervous about seeing Rick, who was still recouping at the Royal Hallamshire Hospital in Sheffield. We had no idea what we were going to say to our friend, who was now facing the end of his drumming career. What else to do but go to a pub to have a few brandies before heading into the hospital? When in doubt, have a drink. When not in doubt, have a drink. That's just how it was back then. When we'd drunk up enough Dutch courage, we went to see him. Rick was sitting in his room, all wrapped up like a mummy. Hello, Rick, we said, in shock at how he looked. Seeing him made it real. Without even saying hello in return, Rick launched into a spirited speech. Okay guys, listen, I've been working on this thing and I'm going to play drums again, but I'm going to use my left foot to do what my left arm used to do, and then I'm going to have all these little pedals, and I'll trigger off all these other sounds, and everything's going to be okay when I play. Steve and I looked at each other thinking, oh, this poor kid, he must be so medicated that he actually thinks he's cool with all this and that everything is going to be okay. That he's going to be a drummer again. It was even sadder than we'd imagined. He was hallucinating. He hadn't just lost his arm. He'd gone mad. How could he think past the pain, much less about ever drumming again? I've been practicing on the edge of the bed. And there was the proof. A pillow on the floor by the edge of the bed. We later found out that Mutt had also been to visit him, and that Mutt, being Mutt, had said that Rick could still play drums, and that a little thing like a loss of limb could be overcome with zen-like willpower, lots of practice, and the available technology of the time.
From here on, glam metal would continue to fight its way to the top, but it would hardly be as carefree and innocent, perhaps, as in those early days. Not only were several of its most prominent bands suffering from addictions fueled by their success, but standing on the sidelines were an increasing number of moral authorities, punks, and even fellow metalheads that were looking to tear into its most visible excesses. Glam metal's ascent to greater prominence still was far from guaranteed. Even commercially, there were voices in trade magazines warning that there was too big a glut in heavy metal as it existed currently. As a great rock band that influenced a lot of these bands once said, it's a long way to the top if you want to rock and roll. And these would-be rock and rollers were about to face the final gatekeepers of the top. Hello all! Thanks for watching my glam metal origins deep dive all the way to the end. Did you like it? Is there anything significant that I accidentally got wrong or left out that you noticed? Please let me know in the comments, especially with the Japanese bits. Oh lord, that was tough to research. Also, be sure to hit the like button down below to further help with the video's engagement. I'm recording this little postscript here at the end of editing, cause phew! It has been a months-long process putting this whole thing together, and finally, I am done. For now. Of course, part 2 to this series is still coming. I'm already collecting news articles and thinking about its structure, so do be sure to subscribe for that. But for the rest of the year, I'm going to be focused on creating more short-form content that's easier to multitask it with. Namely, a review of the King Gizzard concerts I went to at Forest Hills recently, and an update of my King Crimson studio album tier list. And, of course, do look forward to more music talk streams in the future. Hopefully, now that this is done, I can get a lot more consistent with holding them. But until then, I've been Rezi Orenji, and I'll see y'all next time. Bye-bye.